scenes, including lions, bulls, dragons, and other mythical creatures. These vivid images served as a way to communicate the strength and divinity associated with the goddess Ish. The Ishtar Gate was not only a symbol of Babylon's power, but also a celebration of its cultural achievements. The intricate design and craftsmanship displayed on the gate showcase the skill and creativity of the Babylonian artists. Sadly, the gate was heavily damaged over the centuries, with large sections destroyed and lost forever. However, enough remains to give us a sense of its former glory. The Ishtar Gate has captivated the imaginations of explorers, archaeologists, and historians for centuries. Its remaining fragments serve as a reminder of the ancient world's artistic brilliance and the enduring legacy of Babylon as one of history's greatest cities. The pillars that lined the processional way were not merely decorative. Each uncovered artifact, each inscription, and each restored structure brings us closer to understanding the world's first great metropolis. The mysteries of Babylon continue to captivate our imagination, inviting us to unravel the secrets of this ancient wonder. As we stand among the ruins, we can't help but feel a sense of awe and wonder at the rich tapestry of history that surrounds us. From the mighty Ishtar Gate to the enigmatic Hanging Gardens, each site whispers tales of a bygone era, and though time has taken its toll on these ancient structures, their grandeur and beauty endure. Babylon's legacy lives on, inspiring artists, writers, and dreamers to this very day. Its story serves as a reminder of the heights that humanity can reach and the challenges we face in preserving our cultural heritage. As we continue to explore and learn from the ruins of Babylon, we also carry with us the responsibility to protect and cherish these invaluable treasures for future generations. Let us ensure that the echoes of Babylon's past resonate through the ages, reminding us of the importance of cultural preservation and the pursuit of knowledge. They were often intricately carved with images of deities, mythical creatures, and scenes from ancient Mesopotamian mythology. These carvings not only added to the visual grandeur of the entrance, but also served as a way to communicate religious and cultural values to those who entered the city. Unfortunately, like many parts of ancient Babylon, the processional way has fallen into disrepair due to centuries of neglect and the passage of time. What once was a majestic gateway now lies in ruins, leaving us to marvel at its former glory. Explorers and archaeologists continue to unearth sections of the processional way, carefully preserving and restoring them to give visitors a glimpse into what life was like in ancient Babylon. Walking along the remains of this processional way, we can't help but feel a sense of reverence for the grandeur that once stood here. The weathered pillars seem to whisper tales of ancient processions, reminding us of the vibrancy and importance of this once great city. Its multiple levels were reached by a series of ramps and staircases, leading worshippers to a sanctuary at the top where the god's statue was kept. The interior of the temple was richly decorated with intricate carvings and glazed bricks, depicting scenes from Babylonian mythology and daily life. The priests of Marduk performed daily rituals and ceremonies within these sacred walls, ensuring the god's favor for the city and its inhabitants. During festivals, the temple came alive with music, dance, and processions, as the Babylonians celebrated their patron deity in all his glory. However, the temple's grandeur did not shield it from the ravages of war and neglect. Over the centuries, it suffered damage and was neglected, eventually reduced to a shadow of its former self. Today, explorers and archaeologists continue to uncover fragments of the temple's magnificence, piecing together the story of Marduk's temple and the ancient Mesopotamian civilization that flourished in Babylon. However, God, perhaps to test their intentions or to remind them of their mortality, confounded their language, causing confusion and an end to the construction project. This event was said to be the origin of the many languages spoken across the earth. Over time, the tower became known as the Tower of Babel, symbolizing human pride and the consequences of defying divine authority. The archaeological evidence suggests that the real tower, known as Etemenanke, was a stepped pyramid dedicated to the god Marduk. It was a sacred site for the Babylonians, evolving over the centuries with each new ruler adding their own touch to its design and function. The tower was destroyed and rebuilt several times, with its final destruction occurring during the reign of the Persian king Cyrus the Great in the 6th century BC. Despite its ruined state, the Tower of Babel continues to fascinate historians, archaeologists and theologians, serving as a reminder of the ancient world's ambition and the enduring power of faith. To bring a piece of nature to her in the arid Mesopotamian landscape, the king's vision was nothing short of extraordinary. He commissioned the construction of tiered gardens, suspended from arches and supported by massive stone columns. Among the most notable structures within the palace complex is the throne room, where kings held court and dispensed justice. Archaeologists have uncovered remnants of exquisite wall paintings and glazed bricks adorning the throne room, depicting scenes of royal processions and victories in battle. These vibrant images offer a captivating insight into the artistic skill and storytelling traditions of ancient Babylon. The palace also housed a reception hall where diplomats and dignitaries were welcomed. The throne room's grandeur aimed to impress visitors and affirm the king's supreme authority. Unfortunately, much of the palace complex was destroyed by invading forces, leaving us with fragmented pieces of a once magnificent seat of power. While only a fraction of the royal palace remains, its surviving elements continue to captivate our imagination, allowing us to envision the splendor that once graced Babylon's throne room. The colors, designs, and symbols embedded in the palace walls whisper tales of a glorious past, offering us a window into the lives of the kings and queens who once walked those hallowed halls. Lush vegetation, including rare plants and flowers, adorned the terraces, creating a mesmerizing display of cascading greenery. Water flowed through intricate channels, providing the necessary moisture for the gardens to thrive. The hanging gardens were not just a symbol of love, but also a marvel of engineering and an oasis in the desert. Measuring an impressive 30 feet thick at their base, these walls were constructed from sun-dried bricks and bitumen, a sticky black substance obtained from oil wells found in abundance in the region. The circular towers that adorned these walls, every 100 feet, allowed for a comprehensive view of the surrounding landscape. Scholars believe that the city's founder, King Hum, initiated the construction of these walls around 1800 BC. Although they underwent significant expansion and renovation by subsequent rulers, one fascinating feature of Babylon's walls is the Ishtar Gate, intricately decorated with glazed bricks, depicting lions, dragons, and other mythical creatures. It stands as a portal to one of the ancient world's most opulent cities. As you walk along these ancient walls, you can't help but feel a sense of awe and wonder at the ingenuity and determination of the people who built them. The stones silently narrate tales of a glorious past, inviting us to imagine the bustling life that once thrived within Babylon's protective embrace. 6. Hanging Gardens. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the ancient world's most celebrated wonders, have captured the imagination of many. 5. The Great Watchman. The Tower of Babel. The Tower of Babel stands as a prominent landmark in the history of civilization. 4. The Royal Palace. The ruins of Babylon reveal glimpses of the opulence and power of its royal palaces. 3. Temple of Marduk. In the heart of ancient Babylon stood a temple dedicated to Marduk, the patron deity of the city. 2. Processional Way. The processional way in Babylon was an avenue lined with rows of pillars that served as a grand entrance to the city. Number 1. Ishtar Gate. The Ishtar Gate stands as a testament to the artistry and power of ancient Babylon. Exploring the ruins of Babylon allows us to connect with a past that few other places can match. Thermopylae War Explained. The unforgettable battle for Greece. Hello everybody and welcome to my channel. Today we are going to talk about a war that has left an unforgettable mark in history, the Thermopylae War. So if you're interested in learning more about this historical event, stay tuned until the end of the video because trust me, it is going to be a very interesting one. The 300 Spartans who fought against the Persian army at the Battle of Thermopylae were not just warriors, but also highly trained soldiers who had dedicated their lives to military service. They were led by King Leonidas I, a brave and charismatic leader who was respected by his enemies as well as his own people. Leonidas had assembled a force of elite Spartan men who were known for their discipline, courage, and skill in battle. These men had undergone years of rigorous training, both physically and mentally, to prepare them for the ultimate test of their abilities against the vast and powerful Persian army. When the Persian king Xerxes I decided to invade Greece, he assembled a massive force of soldiers from all over his empire. This army, which has become a thing of legend, is said to have numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The Persians were known for their use of superior numbers to overwhelm their opponents, as well as their advanced weaponry and battle tactics. Despite the size of the Persian army, the Spartans were undeterred. They knew that they had to stop the Persian advance into Greece at all costs, even if it meant sacrificing their own lives. The Battle of Thermopylae took place in the narrow pass of Thermopylae, which is located in central Greece. This narrow passageway was chosen by the Spartans as their battleground because it allowed them to use their superior fighting skills and discipline to their advantage. By fighting in a confined space, the Spartans could prevent the Persians from using their superior numbers to outmaneuver them. When the two armies met in battle, it was clear that the Spartans had the upper hand. Their disciplined and coordinated attacks were too much for the Persians to handle, and the Spartans were able to hold off the larger army for days. The fighting was fierce and bloody, with casualties on both sides. However, the Spartans were able to hold their ground and protect the northern entrance to the pass, preventing the Persians from advancing any further into Greece. One of the most famous moments of the battle occurred when King Leonidas and his 300 Spartan warriors faced off against the entire Persian army. According to legend, Leonidas challenged the Persians to a one-on-one combat, and those who accepted his challenge were killed by the Spartans. This display of bravery and skill further cemented the Spartans' reputation as legendary warriors. As the battle raged on, the Spartans continued to hold their ground despite being outnumbered and exhausted. However, they knew that they could not fight forever, and they needed to make a plan for their eventual withdrawal. After several days of fighting, the Spartans decided to make a final stand. They prepared for what would be their last battle, knowing that their sacrifice would buy time for the rest of the Greek forces to regroup and prepare to fight another day. In their final battle, the Spartans fought with even more ferocity than before. They knew that there was no hope of victory, but they were determined to go down in history as heroes. Their bravery and determination inspired the other Greek soldiers who were watching from afar, and the Spartans became known as the ultimate warriors, who sacrificed everything for their country. However, it wasn't only the Spartans who fought valiantly at Thermopylae. Other Greek warriors also played a significant role in the battle. For example, the Thespians were a small but brave group of warriors who joined the Spartans in their defense of Greece. Of the 700 Thespian men who volunteered to fight, Only 192 returned home alive, but they had made a lasting impact on the course of the war. Despite the bravery of the Greek warriors, the Persians were ultimately victorious at the Battle of Thermopylae. The size and diversity of their army proved to be too much for the Spartans and other Greek forces to handle. However, the Spartans' valiant defense of Greece gave the other Greek city-states time to prepare for the Persian invasion, and without the delay caused by the Battle of Thermopylae, the Persians may have been able to conquer Greece more easily. In the aftermath of the battle, the Spartans and other Greeks who had fought at Thermopylae were celebrated as heroes. Their bravery and sacrifice had become a symbol of resistance against tyranny and oppression. In the centuries that followed, their story inspired many other warriors and freedom fighters around the world. So now we understand why the battle was so important. It was a turning point in history. But did you know that there is a place where you can actually visit and see the remnants of the ancient walls that protected the city? That's right. There is a place called the Sacred Band of Thebes. These remains of ancient walls are located in the town of Thebes in central Greece, and they are the only remaining structure from the ancient city that was destroyed by the Persians. According to legend, the Sacred Band of Thebes was built in the 7th century BC by the Theban hero. The band was originally used to protect the city of Thebes from outside invaders, but it later took on a more sacred meaning. It became a symbol of the city's identity and power. After the Persian invasion of Greece in the 5th century BC, the Sacred Band of Thebes became a memorial to the 480 Spartan warriors who died defending the pass of Thermopylae. The Spartans had been part of a larger Greek force that was assembled to stop the Persian king Xerxes I from invading Greece. Although the Persians ultimately won the battle, the Spartans' bravery and selflessness became a thing of legend. To honor the fallen warriors, the Thebans built a series of tombs and monuments along the Sacred Band. These structures were designed to commemorate the bravery of the Spartans and remind future generations of their sacrifice. The Sacred Band of Thebes has remained an important site in Greek history ever since. In the Middle Ages, it became a pilgrimage site for Christians who came to pay their respects to the fallen Spartan warriors. During the Ottoman Empire, the site was neglected, but it was rediscovered during the Greek War of Independence in the early 19th century. Today, the Sacred Band of Thebes is a popular tourist destination and a reminder of the ancient world's greatest heroes. Visitors to the site can explore the remains of the ancient walls and learn about the Spartans' last stand at Thermopylae. You might think that the Battle of Thermopylae was a huge defeat for the Greeks, and in some ways it was. But it was really a strategic victory, because it gave the rest of the Greek city-states time to prepare for the coming war. If the Persians had taken over immediately after the Battle of Thermopylae, they probably would have been able to conquer all of Greece. But instead, the Spartans bought time for the Greeks, which ended up being one of the major factors that helped them win the war. So while the Spartans didn't come out on top at Thermopylae, they did play a vital role in helping the Greeks win the war against the Persians. To sum it up, the Battle of Thermopylae was a clash between two great powers of the ancient world. The Spartans, with their 300 elite warriors, put up a valiant fight against the massive Persian army, holding them off for days and inflicting heavy casualties. While the Persians ultimately won the battle, the Spartans' bravery and sacrifice became a thing of legend, and their story continues to inspire awe and admiration today. The battle also had far-reaching consequences for the course of history. The Spartans' heroic stand at Thermopylae gave the rest of the Greek city-states time to prepare for the Persian invasion, which ultimately led to the Greek victory at the Battle of Salamis. This victory is considered a turning point in history, marking the first time that a large empire had been defeated by a smaller, more determined foe. All right, everybody, This brings us to the end of our video. Thank you all so much for watching and sticking with me until the end. I hope you learned something new and maybe even got a little bit closer to understanding the fascinating history of the 300 Spartans. Don't forget to share your thoughts and opinions in the comment section below. We'd love to hear what you have to say. And if you liked the video, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. That really helps us out a lot. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time. History is full of figures that have been elevated to legendary status. People like Genghis Khan, Napoleon, Julius Caesar, Alexander the Great, and yes, even Elvis. But are these stories true? Well, that's up for debate, because there's a lot of questionable stuff out there about some of history's most famous people. It's me. And let's jump in. Genghis Khan is often regarded as one of the greatest conquerors in history. According to legend, he was born in 1162 in the Mongolian steppe. As a young man, he united many of the tribes of the Mongolian steppe under his banner and went on to found the largest contiguous land empire in history. He was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 40 million people, but did any of this really happen? Well, there is some evidence to suggest that it might have been a bit of a combination. Most historians agree that the Mongols did unite under a guy named Temujin, who later took the title of Genghis Khan, which means ocean-going conqueror. But there is very little evidence that he was actually born in 1160-something, or that he was even called In fact, the name Genghis Khan was unused during his lifetime, and the earliest record we have of the name comes from a Chinese text written almost 300 years after he died. This has led some historians to question whether or not Genghis Khan actually existed at all. It is possible that the legendary figure of Genghis Khan is actually a combination of several different Mongol leaders, or maybe he was just made up by the Chinese to make them look better. We know that the Mongols were a powerful force in the 13th century, and they did conquer a huge chunk of Asia and Eastern Europe, but it's possible that we've been misinformed about who was really in charge. And speaking of legendary conquerors, what about Alexander the Great? Alexander III of Macedon, better known as Alexander the Great, is considered one of the most successful military commanders in history. He conquered the Persian Empire and extended his empire as far east as India. He was known for his military genius and his ability to inspire his troops to great feats of bravery. However, recent research has cast some doubt on these accounts. Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, and one of his generals, Ptolemy I, became the ruler of Egypt. Shortly after Alexander's death, Ptolemy commissioned a number of historians to write accounts of Alexander's life. These histories were highly idealized and portrayed Alexander as a godlike figure, so it's no surprise that modern historians are a bit skeptical of them. In recent years, researchers have uncovered a number of new historical sources that provide a more realistic portrait of Alexander the Great. These sources are much closer to the time period in which Alexander lived, and they offer a more balanced view of his character and accomplishments. They paint a picture of a brilliant but ruthless military commander who was sometimes reckless and irresponsible. One of the most shocking revelations about Alexander the Great is that he may not have even been Greek. You see, back in the day, the Greeks didn't really have a concept of race the way we do today. But when Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, he did take on many Persian wives, and some historians believe that one of these women may have actually been Alexander's mother. If this is true, then Alexander would have had Persian blood, which would have made him even more unpopular with the Greeks. Another surprising fact about Alexander the Great is that he was actually shorter than average for a Macedonian man. According to a recent study, he was only about 5 feet tall. That's about half an inch shorter than the average American male today. Alexander's supposed height has been a source of much debate and speculation throughout history. Some historians have claimed that he was actually 6 feet tall, while others have argued that he was closer to 4 feet 11. The truth is that we do really know how tall Alexander was. But it is safe to say that he was the towering figure that many people believe him to be. So Alexander the Great may not have been Greek, and he may not have been as tall as everyone thinks he was. But was he really as invincible as they say? Well, maybe not. According to legend, Napoleon Bonaparte was born in 1769 on the island of Corsica. He rose to prominence during the French Revolution and eventually became Emperor of France. He waged war against much of Europe, but was eventually defeated and exiled to the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean, where he died in 1821. However, recent research has challenged some of these well-established facts about Napoleon's life. Napoleon's birth year is known as 1769. But in 2016, a group of French historians came forward with new evidence suggesting that he was actually born in 1768. They based their claim on a number of factors, including a discrepancy in the records of Napoleon's baptism. There are also some doubts about the location of Napoleon's birthplace. According to tradition, he was born in the city of Aix, but some historians believe that he may have actually been born in the nearby village of Biserta. There is even some debate over whether or not Napoleon was really born on the island of Corsica at all. You see, Corsica was a part of the Republic of Pisa at the time of Napoleon's birth, but it was also claimed by the Kingdom of Sardinia. Some historians argue that Napoleon's birthplace is actually in modern-day Italy. Of course, the most famous myth about Napoleon is that he was short. It's a common misconception that Napoleon was only about 5 feet 2 inches tall, which would have made him shorter than average, even for the time period. However, recent research has shown that this is not true. Napoleon was actually closer to 5 feet 6 inches tall, which would have been above average for the time period. The myth likely originated from a mismeasurement during the autopsy performed on Napoleon's body after his death. So Napoleon wasn't short, but he wasn't exactly a giant either, and he probably was even born in the year 1769. But if none of these claims can be substantiated, then what can we say for certain about Napoleon? Well, we do know that he was a brilliant military commander and one of the most important figures in European history. But what about some more modern legends? Marilyn Monroe is often regarded as the most famous sex symbol of the 20th century. She was known for her curvaceous figure, her breathy voice, and her comedic timing. But was she really the dumb blonde bombshell that the media portrayed her to be? Well, it turns out that Marilyn Monroe was actually a lot more than just a pretty face. She was a talented actress and comedian who was also very intelligent. In fact, she was a voracious reader and she was fluent in multiple languages. She was also very interested in politics and current events. And she was a major supporter of the civil rights movement. But perhaps the most surprising thing about Marilyn Monroe is that she was not actually born Marilyn Monroe at all. Her birth name was Norma Jean Mortensen, and she changed her name when she began acting. She also had a number of different aliases that she used throughout her life, including Norma Jean Baker, Norma Jean Doherty, Miller, and Mona. James Monroe was the 7th President of the United States, but before he entered politics, he served in the military. In fact, he was one of the founding members of the United States Marine Corps. He was also the first president to live in the White House. But did you know that James Monroe was actually a spy? During the Revolutionary War, Monroe served as an aide to General George Washington. But when Washington was forced to flee New York City in 1776, Monroe was captured by the British and imprisoned. While he was in prison, Monroe was visited by a British intelligence officer who offered him a deal. If Monroe agreed to spy on the Continental Army for the British, he would be released from prison. Monroe accepted the offer, and he spied on the Americans until 1779, when he was caught and sentenced to death. However, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment, and he was eventually released in 1783. But James Monroe wasn't the only American president who had a secret past. Abraham Lincoln is regarded by many as the greatest American president. He led the country through the Civil War and helped to abolish slavery. But did you know that Lincoln had a secret, illegitimate son? In 2011, a man named Robert Lincoln Beck claimed that he was the son of Abraham Lincoln and a woman named Elizabeth Keckley. Beck said that he was born in 1850 and that his mother worked as a seamstress for Mary Todd Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln's wife. Keckley had an affair with President Lincoln, but she was never able to confirm it, and she didn't even tell anyone that she had a son until she was more than 60 years old. Beck's claim was backed up by DNA testing, but it's still not 100% proof that he's Lincoln's son. But here's the crazy part. Abraham Lincoln probably knew that Robert Beck was his son, and he even helped to support him financially for a time. However, he never publicly acknowledged Beck as his son, and he refused to allow him to use the Lincoln name. What about more modern times? Elvis Presley is often referred to as the king of rock and roll. He was known for his energetic performances and his unique blend of musical styles. But what was the real Elvis like? Well, it turns out that he was a lot different from the onstage persona that he cultivated. For example, Elvis was actually very shy off stage, and he was known for being extremely polite and respectful to elders. He was also a devout Christian and a lifelong member of the Church of Christ. Elvis was also a big fan of horror movies, and he collected a number of creepy souvenirs, including a shrunken human head. But perhaps the most shocking fact about Elvis is that he was actually inducted into the military, even though he had managed to avoid the draft several times. In 1954, Elvis was drafted into the U.S. Army, and he served 2 years in Germany. It was during his time in the military that he met Priscilla Ballou, who would later become his wife. Elvis's time in the military was controversial, to say the least. Many people believed that he was using his fame to get out of serving in Korea, and they were not happy about it. But Elvis actually did serve in Korea, even though it was not officially recognized at the time. When he returned home, he was a hero to many, and he used his fame to help promote the military. So what about more recent times? John F. Kennedy is a legendary figure in American history. He was the youngest person ever elected president of the United States, and he was also the first Roman Catholic president. He was assassinated in 1963, and his death is one of the most controversial events in American history. But did any of it really happen? Well, according to a new theory, John F. Kennedy was actually killed by the CIA. The theory is based on the fact that JFK was considering the removal of some of the top CIA officials following the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. This move would have effectively neutered the organization, and CIA Director Allen Dulles was not happy about it. So he and a few other high-ranking officials hatched a plan to assassinate the president. The problem was that they couldn't agree on how to pull it off. Some wanted to use a sniper, but others thought that it would be better to bomb the president's plane. In the end, they decided to go with the plane bombing option, but it didn't work out the way they planned. The plane was indeed bombed, but JFK survived the attack. However, he was killed a few months later in Dallas, Texas, by a sniper. So what do you think? Are any of these legends just myths? Let me know in the comments below. And while you're down there, be sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time. For 10 long years, the greatest heroes of Greece and Troy faced each other beneath the impenetrable city walls. This conflict was not about power or resources, but about honor and one woman, a woman whose beauty launched 1,000 ships. Welcome back to Recchia Production. Today, we delve into the ancient epic that forms the foundation of Western civilization, the Trojan War, the tale immortalized by the legendary blind poet Homer in the Iliad. In the next 10 minutes, we will uncover how did a divine beauty competition ignite the war? Who was mightier, Achilles or Hector? And how did the cunning of one hero, Odysseus, finally end this protracted conflict? Get ready to board the Achaean ships toward the walls of Troy. The Trojan War, though triggered by mortals, was rooted in a dispute among the gods. The story begins at the wedding of King Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis, Achilles' parents. All gods were invited, except one, Eris, the goddess of discord. Eris, furious at being excluded, tossed a golden apple into the feast, inscribed with, "For the fairest." 3 of the most powerful goddesses immediately claimed it: Hera, queen of the gods; Athena, goddess of wisdom and war; and Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. They asked Paris, prince of Troy, who was then a shepherd, to be the judge. The 3 goddesses offered him incredible bribes. Hera, political power to make Paris the mightiest king on earth. Athena, military skill to make him an unconquerable general. Aphrodite, the love of the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris chose Aphrodite, his prize, Helen, who was, unfortunately, already married to Menelaus, king of Sparta, and considered the most beautiful woman in the world. This choice was the trigger for the war. Paris, accompanied by Aphrodite, sailed to Sparta, and while Menelaus was away, he took Helen back to Troy. This act, whether an abduction or a willing elopement, was an insult to the honor of Menelaus and all of Greece. Achaea. The furious Menelaus called upon his brother, Agamemnon, the most powerful king of Mycenae, to lead the united Greek forces. Agamemnon, who desired Troy's wealth and power, readily agreed. The Greek forces assembled their greatest heroes at Aulis, Achilles, the greatest; nearly immortal, Odysseus, the most cunning; king of Ithaca, great Ajax, the strongest; and of course, Agamemnon, commander-in-chief. After difficulties, including the sacrifice of Iphigenia to appease the goddess Artemis, the great Greek fleet finally set sail. They arrived at Troy, a city ruled by King Priam and protected by walls supposedly built by the god Poseidon himself. The war lasted for 10 years. Most of the conflict was a prolonged siege, interspersed with raids, village looting, and, of course, epic duels. Who do you think was the most honorable hero in this conflict? A. Achilles, the hero motivated by glory. B. Hector, the ethical defender of Troy. C. Odysseus, the cunning one who always has a plan. Vote in the comments. Your choice says a lot about what you value: strength, honor, or intelligence. For 9 years, the Greeks could not breach the walls of Troy. The story told by Homer in the Iliad actually only covers a few critical weeks in the 10th year. The heart of the Iliad is the rage of Achilles. The war was nearly won by Troy when Achilles, offended because Agamemnon took his war prize, Briseis, withdrew his troops, the Myrmidons, from battle. Without Achilles, the Greeks were devastated. To save the honor of Greece, Achilles' closest friend, Patroclus, begged permission to lead the Myrmidons, wearing Achilles' armor. Patroclus was successful, but he disobeyed orders and was ultimately killed by Hector, the prince of Troy and their greatest hero. Patroclus's death changed the game. Achilles' rage against Agamemnon turned into a brutal frenzy against Hector. Achilles returned to the battlefield with one goal: revenge. The duel between Achilles and Hector is the climax of the Iliad. Hector knew he would die, but he fought for the honor of his city. Achilles killed him, and, in a fit of overwhelming rage, committed the most despicable act in the epic, dragging Hector's body behind his chariot around the walls of Troy. The conclusion of the Iliad is a moment of humanity, when King Priam sneaks into Achilles' camp and begs for his son's body to be returned. Achilles, seeing Priam's pain, finally releases his rage and allows Hector's burial. Shortly after Hector, Achilles also met his demise. He was killed by a poisoned arrow shot by Paris, aided by the god Apollo, which struck his only weak spot, his heel. With the death of the greatest heroes on both sides, the war reached a stalemate. Troy remained impregnable. This is where cunning, not just strength, was needed. The cunning hero Odysseus came up with a plan that would determine fate. He proposed building a giant wooden statue in the shape of a horse, supposedly a peace offering to the goddess Athena after the Greek defeat. The Greek army pretended to retreat and abandon the horse. The Trojans, despite warnings from Cassandra and the priest Locoon, dragged the horse inside the walls as a trophy of victory. They celebrated the end of the war. That night, as Troy slept soundly, Odysseus and the elite Greek soldiers climbed out of the horse's belly. They opened the city gates, allowing the returning Greek army, under the cover of darkness, to enter. Troy fell in a single night of brutal slaughter. The Trojan War ended the age of heroes. It left a tragic legacy for both the winners and the losers. Troy was totally destroyed, King Priam murdered. A few survivors, like Aeneas, fled to start a new civilization. Greece won, but the victory was soaked in blood. Agamemnon was murdered upon his return, and Odysseus had to spend another 10 years, 20 years in total, to get home. A journey recounted in the Odyssey. The tale of Troy teaches us about the price of honor, the cost of one selfish act. Paris, taking Helen, was the death of thousands of heroes and the destruction of a great civilization. It is an enduring reflection on how human passion can lead to inevitable catastrophe. Please leave a comment. If you were an advisor in Troy, what would you have done about the Trojan horse, considering the warnings about its danger? If you want to delve deeper into ancient mythology and history, make sure to subscribe to Reccia Production and like this video. See you in the next epic. In 146 BCE, the Roman general Scipio Africanus led his army to victory over Hannibal Barca, in a battle that lasted only 3 days. It's known as the Siege of Cartagena, and it changed the Mediterranean forever. If you have ever heard of it, after the battle, Hannibal fled to Asia Minor, where he spent the next 3 years raising new armies in an attempt to save his homeland. But Rome was prepared for him. One of the first things you want to do when researching any topic is figure out some background information. This is especially important for something like the Second Punic War, since it's such a massive topic that has been studied by historians for centuries. Drawing conclusions is basically what it sounds like. It's taking all of the information that you've gathered and using it to draw informed conclusions. In the case of the Second Punic War, this means taking all of the information that we've gathered from our secondary and primary sources and using it to draw conclusions about how Rome won the war. One of the most important things to keep in mind when drawing conclusions is to be objective. This means not letting your own biases and opinions get in the way of your thinking. Instead, you need to look at all of the evidence objectively and let it speak for itself. Another important thing to keep in mind is to cite your sources. This is especially important when doing historical research, since it's so easy to misquote or misrepresent sources. Make sure to always give credit where credit is due, and cite all of the sources that you use in your research. Luckily for us, there are plenty of resources available on the internet that can help us learn more about this topic. Well, For starters, it's clear that the Romans were able to outlast Carthage. The Punic Wars were fought over a span of nearly 200 years, and during that time, Rome was able to build up a huge advantage in terms of military power and resources. Additionally, Rome was able to take advantage of the mistakes made by Carthage. One of the biggest mistakes that Carthage made was their decision to go to war with Rome in the first place. The Carthaginians were a powerful force to be reckoned with, and they had a strong economy and a powerful military. However, they were no match for the Romans, who were able to use their superior military tactics and their sheer determination to outlast them. First off, we've got websites like Livius.org. This website is dedicated to the history of ancient Rome. It marked the end of the Second Punic War and the beginning of Rome's dominance over the Mediterranean. By understanding how Rome won the siege, we can gain a greater appreciation for the factors that led to Rome's rise to power. If you want to learn more about this topic, be sure to check out the additional resources provided, and it's got tons of articles on all sorts of topics related to the city. For background information on the Second Punic War, I'd recommend checking out their article on the Battle of Cannae. It's a really well-written piece that gives a great overview of this pivotal moment in the war. We also have Polybius's book, The Histories. It's an epic work that covers everything from the Second Punic War to the rise of the Roman Empire. It's a little bit tough to get through, since it was written in Greek, but there are translations available online that make it a lot more accessible. And finally, there are documentaries. And when it comes to documentaries, you can't go wrong with the BBC. Their documentary on the fall of Carthage is really well made, and it gives a great overview of this crazy chapter in history. They had anticipated his every move, and they were ready to stop him. So, how did Rome win? Primary sources are original materials that were created during the time period being studied. They're invaluable for getting an authentic look at the past, and they can include things like letters, diaries, and even pieces of art. Luckily for us, there are plenty of primary sources available that can help us learn more about the Second Punic War. For instance, we've got letters from the Roman statesman Cicero. Was a contemporary of Julius Caesar, and he wrote a ton of letters covering everything from politics to philosophy. Many of his letters discuss the war with Carthage, and they give a great insight into how the Romans viewed their enemies. We also have the writings of Polybius. As I mentioned before, Polybius was a Greek historian who lived during the Second Punic War, and he wrote a detailed account of the conflict. His work is considered to be one of the most comprehensive and accurate accounts of the war, and it's a great resource for anyone wanting to learn more about it. And finally, there are archaeological finds. Over the years, archaeologists have uncovered a wealth of artifacts that have shed light on the Second Punic War. These include things like coins, weapons, and even pieces of artwork. The most famous discovery probably has to be the Zama treasure, a collection of silver coins that were minted in North Africa during the war. The coins are decorated with images of Hannibal and other figures from the conflict, and they offer a unique glimpse into the culture of the time. Well, it's not some simple tale of good versus evil, that's for sure. In fact, the story of Rome's victory over Carthage is actually a pretty messed up one, which, let's be honest, is probably unlikely, unless you are an expert in ancient history or really just have very little going on in your life. Now, luckily for us, there are tons of resources available on the internet that can help us learn more about this topic. First off, we have websites like Ancient History Encyclopedia. These guys are great, because they have tons of articles written by experts on all sorts of topics related to ancient history. Their website is super easy to navigate to, so it makes it really easy to find exactly what you're looking for. Next up, we've got books. And hey, yes, books are still a thing, even though we live in a digital world. For this particular topic, I'd recommend checking out Carthage Must Be Destroyed by Richard Miles. It is a really well-written book that tells the story of Rome's destruction of Carthage in all its gory detail. And finally, there are documentaries. And when it comes to documentaries, you can't go wrong with the BBC. Their documentary on the fall of Carthage is really well made, and it gives a great overview of this crazy chapter in history. You may have also heard that it was one of the largest sieges in ancient history, a struggle between Rome and Carthage for dominance over the Mediterranean. But if I were to tell you that this war was actually decided by a single battle that lasted only 3 days, you would probably call me a liar. And hey, I don't blame you, because that's exactly what I thought when I first learned about it too. It just seems crazy to think that a war that lasted for 13 years could have been decided so quickly. But trust me, it's true. Hannibal's defeat at Zama marked the end of the Second Punic War and the beginning of Rome's dominance over the Mediterranean. To understand how this happened, we first need to evaluate our reference sources and make sure they're credible and relevant. Now that we've got our sources lined up, let's dive into the topic at hand. So now that we've got some background information under our belts, let's move on to evaluating primary sources. Now that we've evaluated our primary sources, it's time to move on to the next step in the research process, drawing conclusions. So what conclusions can we draw about how Rome won the Second Punic War? Overall, the siege of Carthage was a turning point in ancient history. I want to talk about one of my favorite topics, Athenian naval power in the Golden Age, and the rise and fall of the Delian League. You can check out our series on the Peloponnesian War for more information on that topic. In 478 BC, an alliance of Greek city-states, known as the Delian League, was formed with the objective of liberating the Aegean Islands from Persian control after the end of the Second Persian War. The League was named after its first major meeting on the island of Delos, and would go on to include over 300 member states at its peak. At the heart of this coalition was the dominant force in the region, the city of Athens. When the war began, Athens had a navy of around 200 ships, and after defeating the Persians at the Battle of Mycale in 466, gained control of many more triremes, including those captured from the enemy. According to Thucydides, some were manned by the allies of Athens, while others were taken by the Athenians themselves. In all, they seized 180. This victory turned the balance of power in the region completely on its head. Athens went from being just one of several great powers in Greece to the unrivaled maritime hegemon of the Aegean, controlling more territory than any other state and having a navy large enough to project power throughout the Mediterranean. Following the war, Athens used its naval superiority to impose a blockade on the Persian Empire in the Aegean, forcing them to pay tribute in order to keep their trade routes open. By controlling the seas, Athens also solidified its dominance within the Delian League, which had now become little more than an Athenian empire. Athens demanded that every member of the League contribute a certain number of ships to the navy or pay a sum of money instead, if they couldn't afford to do so. The goal was to have a navy of 200 ships at all times. However, since the Allies weren't required to provide sailors to man these vessels, the actual number of warships ready for battle was usually closer to 180. Athens took the treasury of the League, which had been established on the island of Delos, to store the tribute collected from the Allies, and moved it back to the city. Over time, this pool of funds would be used to finance Athens' building projects, cultural achievements, and military expeditions across the Mediterranean. Athens' success during this period led to what is often referred to as the Golden Age of Athens, a time of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and cultural achievement. Pericles, a prominent statesman, came to prominence and led the city through its most glorious years. During this period, the Parthenon, one of the ancient world's most iconic structures, was built. as well as many other public buildings, temples, and statues. The foundations of Athenian democracy were established, and the city became a center of philosophy, art, and literature. Historians like Thucydides chronicled the events of the era, while playwrights such as Sophocles and Euripides produced tragedies that explored the depths of human emotion and the complexities of morality. The age was indeed golden for Athens. But this prosperity and expansion didn't last forever. By the 440s BC, the growing resentment among the allies over Athens' increasingly oppressive rule culminated in a revolt against Athenian hegemony. The Corinthian War was the first major challenge to Athenian supremacy. It began when Corcyra, also known as Corfu, a city-state located at the far western edge of the Greek mainland, sought aid from Sparta against Athens. Athens had previously intervened in Corcyra's internal affairs, supporting one faction against another in a long-standing internal conflict, and there was bad blood between the two sides. However, Sparta didn't feel threatened by Athenian involvement in the Western Mediterranean and accepted the request. To Sparta, Athens' growing power was becoming a concern, and they saw an opportunity to weaken the hegemony with minimal risk to themselves. Around the same time, the Megarian decree, issued by Athens a few years earlier, prohibiting Megara from trading with any of its allies, had caused economic hardship and resentment among the people of Megara. Sparta came to their aid and rallied many of the Peloponnesian League members into a coalition against Athens. Other states with grievances against Athens, such as Thera, now known as Santorini, also joined the conflict. After 5 years of inconclusive fighting, the war ended with the Peace of Nicias, which left the balance of power largely unchanged. But the respite was short. A new conflict soon broke out when the Corinthians persuaded Sparta to renew the war against Athens. Sparta now felt that it had a chance to defeat Athens because of the latter's loss of manpower due to the plague of Athens, a devastating epidemic that struck the city in 430 BC. This Second Peloponnesian War would prove to be much more costly for Athens, leading to the decline of its empire and the city's ultimate defeat. While Athens had initially enjoyed success during the early years of the war, the tide turned against them in 421 BC with the Peace of Nicaea. This treaty allowed Athens to escape a total defeat, but it also forced them to abandon many of their allies, who now found themselves without Athenian protection. As the war dragged on, Athens lost even more allies. Some switched sides to join the Spartans, while others simply chose to leave the alliance and become independent. The most significant departure was that of the displeased with Athenian policies, they revolted and requested Spartan assistance. After much debate, the Spartans decided to help, sending an army to assist the Chians against the Athenians. As the Peloponnesian forces approached the island, the Chians handed over their city without resistance, allowing the Spartans to occupy it. From here, Sparta launched raids into the Aegean, capturing many islands that had previously been part of the Delian League. With each passing year, Athens' hold over the Aegean weakened. By the end of the war, only a handful of islands remained loyal to the Athenians. Even though the Delian League had effectively ceased to exist by this point, the concept of a Panhellenic alliance continued to persist. Pericles' dream of a united Greece, free from Persian domination, had failed. Instead, Athens' empire had collapsed, and the stage was set for centuries of conflict. As the Peloponnesian War continued, both sides suffered heavy losses. Athens, weakened by disease and war, experienced social and political instability, ultimately leading to the rise of the 30 Tyrants, a brutal oligarchy that ruled the city after the war's end. Meanwhile, Sparta, despite its military successes, was unable to capitalize fully on the defeat of Athens due to internal conflicts. Thucydides believed that neither side could truly win a total victory against the other. And so it proved. Neither Athens nor Sparta survived the following century, with both eventually succumbing to foreign invaders. But before their collapse, both states would fight many more wars against each other and their respective former allies. Eventually, the Delian League evolved into something very different than its founders had envisioned. While Athens did succeed in expelling the Persians from the Aegean and Western Asia Minor, as Pericles intended, it exploited its naval supremacy to dominate its allies, rather than liberate them. Athens' actions were primarily motivated by it extracted massive amounts of money from its allies, forbade them from making war with each other, and enforced strict economic policies to prevent any of them from becoming too powerful. For example, when Melos refused to join the Delian League and paid tribute, Athens invaded and subjugated the island. The Melians subsequently sent an embassy to Athens to negotiate terms for their city's surrender, but when their pleas for mercy fell on deaf ears, they attempted to bribe the Athenian assembly with gold. Again, their attempt to buy their freedom was rejected, and Athens proceeded to lay siege to the island. The Melians resisted for several years, but eventually they ran out of water and surrendered. All the men were killed and the women and children enslaved. Athens then used Melos as an example to discourage any other potential challengers from defying its rule. As historian Donald Kagan wrote, the Delian League was one of the earliest examples of a truly aggressive foreign policy based primarily on the acquisition of empire and wealth. The Delian League wasn't an altruistic project. Athens didn't seek to liberate other city-states from Persian rule, because it genuinely cared about their freedom. Rather, it wanted to expand its own power and wealth. Athens hoped that by imposing a stable and secure peace throughout the Aegean, it could protect its own security and encourage trade and commerce throughout the region. In doing so, Athens would prosper economically and become the dominant naval power in the Mediterranean. Athens never concealed its imperial ambitions. Its leaders openly declared that the League had been formed to dominate the sea and extract tribute from its enemies. Pericles, arguably the greatest statesman in Athenian history, epitomized this pragmatic and self-interested approach to politics. He famously told the Athenians that it was perfectly acceptable to deceive their allies, but not their people. Athens carefully cultivated an image of virtue and justice to maintain popular support at home, yet it exploited its allies abroad. It was willing to go to great lengths to advance its national interests and ensure its position as the preeminent power in the region. So what can we learn from the rise and fall of the Delian League? The answer is probably simple: nothing. Every civilization has its ups and downs. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose. The secret to surviving as a civilization for hundreds of years is unnecessarily to try and win every single time. Perhaps it's okay to lose a battle or two as long as you win the war. If Athens had done that, maybe it could have kept its empire longer. Who knows? Anyways, thanks for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more videos. Imagine a time 3,000 years ago. The wealthiest and wisest king in the world, King Solomon or Nabi Suleiman, sits on his throne in Jerusalem. His wealth is legendary gold, silver, sandalwood, and spices beyond measure. But for centuries, a question has haunted historians. Where did it all come from? Ancient texts point to a mysterious land called Ophir. For generations, seekers looked in Africa, India, and Arabia. But a tiny archaeological discovery in the ruins of Turkey, Syria, changed the game. Inside a jar, buried in 1700 BC, centuries before Solomon's reign, scientists found cloves. Why is this a global shocker? Because, in the ancient world, the clove tree, Syzygium aromaticum, only grew in one place on the entire planet, the Maluku Islands of Indonesia. If cloves reached the Middle East thousands of years before the Common Era, is it possible that King Solomon's Golden Paradise was actually in Nusantara? Today, we go on a journey across time to deconstruct the most controversial theory in Indonesian history. In the Book of 1 Kings, it is recorded that Solomon built a fleet of large ships in Ezion Geber. These ships traveled to Ophir and returned with 420 talents of gold. There is a technical detail often overlooked. The round trip to Ophir took 3 years. If Ophir were simply in Ethiopia or nearby India, the voyage would not have taken that long. Even with the maritime technology of the Phoenicians, who were the NASA of their era. However, if the destination was across the Indian Ocean, through the Strait of Malacca, reaching the Spice Islands of eastern Indonesia, a 3-year duration becomes perfectly logical for sailing vessels dependent on seasonal monsoon winds. The list of cargo brought back is highly specific. 1. Gold. Indonesia has a deep history of ancient gold mining. Sumatra was historically called Suvarnadvipa, or the Island of Gold. 2. Sandalwood, a commodity native to the islands of Timor and Sumba. 3. Apes and peacocks, flora and fauna that are abundant in the tropical jungles of Southeast Asia. Let's pause. Look at the facts. Gold, sandalwood, and a 3-year voyage. Which sounds more like the source of riches to you? Africa, India, or Indonesia? Type your choice in the comments right now. Let's talk science. Cloves are the smoking gun of this theory. In the ancient world, cloves weren't just a kitchen spice. They were a high-value medical and ritual commodity, often worth more than gold. Until the 18th century, clove trees were botanically endemic. This means they did not grow anywhere else except on 5 tiny volcanic islands in the Moluccas: Ternate, Tidore, Motir, Makian, and Batkan. Archaeologist Giorgio Bucciolotti discovered charred cloves in a modest home in Turkey, on the banks of the Euphrates. Carbon dating placed them at 1700 BC. This proves that a global trade network connected Indonesia to the Middle East nearly 4,000 years ago. If Maluku spices had already reached Syria by 1700 BC, then by Solomon's Golden Age, around 950 BC, this trade route would have been a well-oiled machine. This sparks the ultimate speculation. Did King Solomon have a direct diplomatic line with a kingdom in Nusantara to secure his supply of gold and spices? We cannot discuss this topic without addressing the most famous local theory, popularized by the late K. H. Fahmi Basia. He used a mix of linguistic and mathematical analysis to claim that Solomon's kingdom was centered in central Java. The theory points out several curious coincidences. Sabah, linked to Wonosobo, the forest of Sabah. Sleman, linked to Solomon or Ratu Boko, linked to the palace of the Queen of Sheba Balkis. The ruins of a palace atop a hill near Prambanan are claimed to be the remnants of the palace moved by Solomon's jinn in a single blink of an eye. Fahmi Basia argued that Borobudur Temple is actually a remnant of the structures built by Solomon's army of jinn. He referenced the Quranic verse about jinn building lofty palaces, statues, and basins as large as reservoirs. Of course, mainstream archaeologists reject this. Historically, Borobudur was built by the Shalendra dynasty in the 8th century, a diagap of 1,800 years from Solomon's time. However, proponents believe Borobudur was a renovation or a reconstruction on a much older, sacred site. In Western tradition, the Queen of Sheba is from Ethiopia or Yemen. But if Ophir is in Indonesia, could the queen have been a ruler from Nusantara? Some researchers point to the description of the land of Sheba as a lush, fertile paradise. The Quran describes Sabah as Baldatun Tayyibatan, Wa Rabban Gafura, land most good and fair. There is speculation that Saba wasn't just a city, but a maritime federation in Nusantara. If the queen brought spices in great abundance to Solomon, no other place on earth at that time had the reserves that the Moluccas and Western Indonesia possessed. We must be critical, though. Archaeologically, the Sabaean kingdom in Yemen with the Great Dam of Mrib is well documented and fits the timeline. Is it possible there were two Sabas, or was the Saba in Nusantara a colony of the one in Yemen? We are entering a very grey area of history here. We have seen real botanical evidence of cloves, the mystery of the 3-year voyage, and controversial claims about physical footprints in Java. Is this all a series of coincidences? Or is the history we learned in school incomplete? We will dive even deeper. Where exactly was the golden port of Ophir in Sumatra? We will look at ancient DNA analysis and how remnants of sandalwood from Nusantara were found in the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs. And most importantly, what does modern science say about a possible genetic link between the Middle East and Nusantara in ancient times? I want to know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how convinced are you that there was a direct link between King Solomon and Indonesia? To find the next clue, we have to travel even further back in time and go deep inside the mummification chambers of ancient Egypt. Why did the pharaohs of the 19th dynasty, like Ramses the Great, smell like the rainforests of Sumatra? And how did a specific resin from an Indonesian tree end up in the nostrils of a god king 3,000 miles away? The camphor connection, Barus, and the pharaohs. In 1976, the mummified remains of Ramses II were flown to Paris for preservation. Among the many discoveries made by French scientists was a chemical signature that baffled historians: camp, the biology of the Barus tree. In the ancient world, there were many resins, but only one true camphor, known as Kappa barus. It comes from the Dryobalanops aromatica tree. This tree is incredibly picky. It only grows in the northern parts of Sumatra, specifically around a port called Barus. Why does this matter? Because camphor was essential for mummification. It acted as a powerful preservative and a masking agent for odors. If Ramses II, who lived nearly 300 years before King Solomon, was preserved using Sumatran camphor, it proves that the spice route wasn't just a minor trail. It was a massive, high-speed maritime highway connecting Indonesia to Egypt. The port of Barus. Barus is one of the oldest inhabited places in Indonesia. Archaeologists have found Middle Eastern pottery and Roman coins there. It was the Silicon Valley of its time, a place where the world's most precious chemical and most sought-after resin benzoin were traded for gold and silver. When King Solomon looked for a partner to find the finest commodities for his temple, he didn't need to discover a new land. He simply needed to tap into the existing Barus network that had already been supplying Egypt for centuries. The linguistic code, Hebrew's secret debt to Sanskrit, the most undeniable evidence of Solomon's connection to Southeast Asia, is unfound in the dirt. It's found in the dictionary. The Old Testament was written in ancient Hebrew. But when the writers had to describe the exotic items brought from Ophir, they ran into a problem. They didn't have words for them. So, they did what we do today. They borrowed the local names. 1. The mystery of Tuqiyim. For centuries, the Hebrew word Tuqiyim was translated as peacocks. But scholars like Koyim Rabin pointed out that the word has no Hebrew root. However, in Tamil, the language of the traders in the Malacca Strait, the word for peacock is toke in Hebrew. It became tuki to the kof and copy connection. The Bible says Solomon imported kophim, apes. In Sanskrit and Old Javanese, the word for monkey is copy. The linguistic link is almost identical. 3. Almog and Valmuka. Solomon's temple was built using almog wood, sandalwood, Many linguists believe this is a corruption of the Sanskrit Valmuka, referring to the high-quality sandalwood found in the Indonesian archipelago. Think about that. If Solomon was getting his goods from Africa, why is the Bible using Southeast Asian and Indian words to describe them? It's like someone today using the word sushi, even if they've never been to Japan. You know exactly where that food originated. Mount Ophir, the Golden Peaks of Sumatra. If you search for Mount Ophir today, you won't find it in Israel. You won't find it in Jordan. You will find it in West Sumatra, Indonesia. When the Portuguese and British explorers arrived in Sumatra in the 1500s and 1600s, they didn't name the mountain Ophir just for fun. They named it based on the local legends they heard from the inhabitants of the Minangkabau Highlands, the gold of the highlands. Sumatra was the Klondike of the ancient world. The gold found in the Pasaman and Logas regions was famous for its purity. Local myths spoke of a great king from the west who sent ships to collect the gold of the sun. Even more interesting is the proximity. Mount Ophir, now known as Mount Talamo, sits right near the coast, perfectly positioned for ships arriving from the Indian Ocean. Geologically, Sumatra sits on a massive gold belt that has been mined for at least 3,000 years. If Solomon wanted 420 talents of the world's best gold, Sumatra was the most logical destination on the map. Look at this map. This is a British maritime chart from the 1700s. See that? Mount Ophir. Why would the world's best navigators use that name if there wasn't a deep-rooted historical belief? What do you think? Type tradition if you think the name has deep roots. The Sunderland theory and genetic echoes. There is an even deeper layer to this story. Some scientists believe that the connection between the Middle East and Indonesia isn't just about trade, it's about bloodlines. The Sunderland theory suggests that Southeast Asia was a high civilization during the last ice age. When the ice melted and the land sank, the survivors migrated. Some went to India, some to the Mediterranean, and some stayed. The genetic bridge. Recent genetic studies have found fascinating haplogroup markers shared between populations in the Levant and the Indonesian archipelago. While this doesn't prove Solomon was Indonesian, it does prove that humans have been traveling back and forth between these two regions for over 10,000 years. If there was a shared genetic and cultural memory of a paradise in the East, it explains why King Solomon, with his vast wisdom and resources, would be so obsessed with reaching it. He wasn't discovering a new world. He was returning to an ancient one. Critical analysis, fact, or beautiful fiction. Now, we have to be honest. As much as we love this theory, we have to look at the counter-arguments. 1. The timeline problem. Mainstream archaeology states that the great stone temples of Indonesia, like Borobudur, were built in the 8th and 9th centuries AD, that is, nearly 1,800 years after King Solomon. For Borobudur to be Solomon's temple, our entire understanding of carbon dating and Southeast Asian history would have to be wrong. 2. The Sabaean Kingdom in Yemen. The archaeological evidence for the kingdom of Sabasheba in Yemen is very strong. We have found their dams, their inscriptions, and their cities. Most historians believe the Queen of Sheba was a South Arabian monarch, not a Javanese queen. So, does that mean the theory is dead? Not necessarily. Many believe that the names and legends were passed down. Perhaps the Sabah in Indonesia was a colony of the one in Yemen. Or perhaps Solomon's influence was so great that later Indonesian kings, like the Shalendras, built their temples as an homage to the legendary wisdom of Solomon. The legacy of Ophir. Whether King Solomon actually sat on a throne in central Java or simply sent his fleet to the shores of Sumatra, the conclusion is the same. Indonesia has never been isolated. From the cloves in a Syrian jar 3,700 years ago to the camphor in the lungs of a pharaoh. Nusantara has been the heartbeat of global trade since the dawn of civilization. We were the givers of riches to the greatest empires of the West. The Ophir mystery isn't just about a lost king. It's about recognizing that the ground we walk on in Indonesia is paved with the history of the world. We are the Golden Land. We are the paradise of spices. Thank you for joining us on this 5,000-word journey. History is a puzzle, and every day we find a new piece. What mystery should we investigate next? The lost city of Atlantis in the Java Sea, or the secrets of the Majapahit Navy? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who needs to know how great our history truly is. I'm Retya Production. Keep searching for the truth. After spending 10 years fighting in Troy, one hero thought his troubles were over. He was Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, the architect behind the Trojan horse. But he was deeply mistaken. That victory was only the beginning of a much longer nightmare.
By the will of Zeus, we'll get home.
Welcome back to Retya Production. Today, we will follow one of the most epic and harrowing homecomings ever told in history, the Odyssey, immortalized by Homer. 10 years of travel, 10 years of suffering, all stemming from one fatal mistake. In the next 10 minutes, we will uncover: why did the god of the sea Poseidon curse Odysseus? How did he use his intelligence to survive monsters and magic? And most dramatically, how did he finally cleanse his palace that had been taken over by trespassers? Let's sail through Greek mythology. The journey of Odysseus, the Odyssey, begins immediately after the fall of Troy. Initially, the journey home seemed easy. But he soon made 2 mistakes that sealed his fate. 1. Ismaros city of the Chacones. Odysseus and his men attacked the city of Ismaros and plundered it. However, they lingered too long celebrating, giving the locals a chance to counterattack. This was the first sign of his crew's greedy and undisciplined nature. 2. Cyprus and the Cyclops. A divine storm pushed them to the island of the Cyclopes, one-eyed giants who did not respect the laws of Zeus' hospitality. In the cave of the Cyclops, Polyphemus, Odysseus lost several men. To escape, he demonstrated his legendary cunning. He intoxicated Polyphemus and blinded his single eye with a heated stake. He tricked the Cyclops by identifying himself as nobody, Autis. But while escaping, Odysseus made a fatal mistake of hubris arrogance. He shouted back to the shore, revealing his true name to Polyphemus.
Titan, I am alive! Odysseus is alive! And you cannot stop me!
Polyphemus was the son of Poseidon, the mighty god of the sea. The Cyclops immediately called upon his father to curse Odysseus.
Father, avenge me! Father!
From that moment on, Odysseus's journey home, which should have been brief, was cursed by Poseidon. Every step would be thwarted by storms, obstacles, and suffering for the next 10 years. The first major hardship came at the hands of his own crew. They arrived at the island of Aiolos, the god of winds, who gave Odysseus a leather bag containing all the ill winds. The good winds were left to guide them home. just as they were about to arrive in Ithaca. The curious and suspicious crew opened the bag while Odysseus slept. The bad winds immediately escaped and blew them back to Iolaus, who now refused to help, believing Odysseus was cursed by the gods. After losing nearly all his ships to the Lastrygonians' man-eating giants, Odysseus arrived at the island of the sorceress Circe. Circe was infamous for turning sailors into pigs. Half of Odysseus's crew fell victim. Odysseus, with assistance from the god Hermes, who gave him a magical herb moly, was immune to Circe's magic and forced her to release his crew.
Here, eat this.
No, that's moly. It's poison.
I'm giving it to you. A god to a mortal.
No, I refuse.
Fine. But it is the only way to stop the witch Circe's spell. Don't you trust me? She knows you are coming. But now, when you drink her honeyed potion, you will remain a man. This will catch the witch off guard.
They stayed with Circe for 1 year in luxury. To continue his journey, Circe gave Odysseus one grim instruction. He must travel to the underworld and consult with the prophet Tiresias.
Stay! Stay! Stay back! This ram is not for you! Stay!
The journey to the underworld provided Odysseus with the roadmap to his destiny. He would return home, but only after much suffering, and he must avoid disturbing the sacred herds of the sun god Helios. Odysseus faced a choice between two equally deadly threats. Which path did he choose? A. The path where he would lose all his crew. B. The path where he would only lose some of his crew. C. The path where he risked his own life but saved all the crew. Answer in the comments. His adventures were often about choosing the lesser of two evils. Returning from the underworld, he faced new obstacles. First, the Sirens, creatures who lured sailors to their death with their irresistible songs. On Circe's advice, Odysseus ordered his crew to plug their ears with wax, while he himself was tightly bound to the mast, becoming the only man to hear the Sirens' song and live.
Who's to say I'm not already mad?
May I be bound with you?
No. I trust only my own strength to hear what no man has left to tell. Tyra! Tyra!
Recording the Siren's song would be such an important piece of...
The gods may yet fill your log, Homer. What sorcery is this?
Next was the narrow strait between the six-headed monster, Scylla, and the deadly whirlpool. Odysseus chose to sail past Scylla, knowing he would inevitably lose 6 of his crew. But it was the lesser loss than losing the entire ship to Charybdis. His greatest tragedy came on the island of the sun god Helios. Repeatedly warned not to touch the sacred cattle, Odysseus's starving crew, while he was asleep, slaughtered and feasted on the herd. This was the final insult to the gods. As punishment, Zeus unleashed a storm that destroyed their ship, drowning everyone except Odysseus. He drifted for days, the sole survivor. Odysseus was stranded on the island of Ogygia, home to the beautiful nymph Calypso. Calypso, falling in love with him, offered him immortality and to stay with her forever. Odysseus refused, yearning for his wife Penelope and his home in Ithaca. He was trapped there for 7 years until Zeus ordered Calypso to release him. After 10 total years of travel, Odysseus finally arrived in Ithaca. However, the situation was fraught with tension. During his absence, hundreds of greedy suitors had invaded his palace, attempting to marry Queen Penelope and seize Odysseus's wealth.
The boy.
Lord Antinous, Lord Eurymachus, nobles of Ithaca, you have brought news of my father?
News? No.
Your father is long dead.
You cannot say that. There is no proof!
Everyone who fought at Troy has long returned home. Either Lord Odysseus is dead, lost in Poseidon's graveyard, or he has chosen not to return. To abandon your mother, his kingdom, and you.
Now your mother will choose one of us and marry again.
Odysseus arrived disguised as an old beggar, a disguise only recognized by his old dog, Argos, a poignant scene, and his elderly nurse, Euryclea. Penelope, loyal but distressed, staged a competition. Whoever could string Odysseus's great bow and shoot an arrow through 12 axe handles would become her husband. None of the suitors succeeded. Finally, the old beggar, Odysseus, asked for a chance. He strung the long-unused bow with ease and successfully shot the arrow through the axes. Immediately, his disguise ended. With the help of his son Telemachus and a few loyal servants, Odysseus locked the hall doors and began the slaughter of the suitors. It was a brutal and bloody end, punishing all who had plundered his wealth and disrespected his home's honor. Finally, after convincing Penelope, who was still disbelieving through secret knowledge of their bed, Odysseus regained his throne, his wife, and peace in Ithaca. The story of the Odyssey is not just about battling monsters. It is a study of perseverance, nostos, and identity. 10 years in Troy and 10 years at sea. Our hero lost his ships, his crew, and nearly lost his home. But he never lost his intelligence, and most importantly, his hope to return. Odysseus's tale is a timeless reminder that the toughest journey is often not to war, but the journey home. Please leave a comment if you were Odysseus. Which temptation, the sirens, Circe, or Calypso, would have been the hardest to resist, and why? If you want to delve deeper into Greek mythology and epics, be sure to subscribe to Rechia Production and like this video. See you in the next heroic tale. A war between two of history, as most famous cultures, could have happened in a way that no one expected. Hello everyone, I am here to introduce you to a new series where we look at what might have happened in ancient times. Today we're going to look at a clash between two of history's most famous cultures, the Jews and the Babylonians. This will be the first in a series covering the Jewish-Babylonian War. In this episode, we'll look at how the war started and the early stages of the conflict. Make sure to stay tuned for more episodes in this series, including episodes covering major battles and figures from the war. Let me know in the comments below if there are other conflicts you'd like me to cover in this format. Without further ado, let's get into today's video. We last left off with the Neo-Babylonian Empire having recently conquered much of the Middle East, and now looking towards expanding their empire further. King Nebuchadnezzar II looked over his domain and saw that he had many different cultures under his rule, each with their own gods and customs. He is even said to have been half Jewish himself, being the son of an older Median wife. However, not everyone was happy under his rule, including the people of Judah, who refused to worship the Babylonian gods and remained faithful to Yahweh. This tension between Yahweh and the Babylonian gods would lead to one of the most significant wars in Jewish history. The Babylonian Empire had reached its peak in the 6th century BCE. Under the rule of Nabopolassar, the empire covered parts of modern-day Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Palestine, and Israel. His son, Nebuchadnezzar II, would continue this trend of expansion and would conquer Jerusalem in 597 BCE, deporting many of the elite members of society to Babylon. However, a revolt would soon break out in Judah against Babylonian rule, which would prompt Nebuchadnezzar to lay siege to Jerusalem once again. The siege lasted for a full year before the city fell in 586 BCE. This time, Nebuchadnezzar would destroy the Temple of Yahweh and deport many of the remaining Judeans to Babylon. Following the destruction of the temple, some Jews would continue to rebel against their Babylonian conquerors. In 563 BCE, a Judean prince named Sheshbazzar would lead a revolt against the Babylonians, with the support of the Persian king Cyrus the Great. Cyrus was interested in conquering Babylon to expand his own empire. Thus, he supported the Judeans in their rebellion against their common enemy. With outside support, the Jews were able to successfully push back the Babylonians and rebuild their temple. However, when Nebuchadnezzar's successor, Evil Merodach, took the throne, he would take action against the Jews. Evil Merodach began by deporting Sheshbazzar from Judah and replacing him with a man named Bagoas. However, this proved to be ineffective, as Bagoas was killed by the Jewish leader Ezra while he was on his way to take control of Judah. In response, Evil Merodach would march on Jerusalem, but he too would meet his demise shortly after. According to the Book of Kings, God struck him down with an incurable disease. Some historians speculate that this may have been a case of leprosy. If this is true, it would have been a particularly ironic end for the Babylonian king, as the Babylonians believed that they were cured lepers. Regardless, the throne then passed to Evil Merodach's brother, Nergal-Shara-Baladan, who set about crushing the Jewish revolt. Much of what we know about Nergal-Shara-Baladan comes from a boastful letter that he sent to the Assyrian king, in which he details all of his military victories during his reign. While Nergal-Shara-Baladan made many claims in this letter, none of them can be corroborated by any historical evidence. Many scholars agree that he likely embellished or even fabricated these claims to appear stronger than he really was. Thus, the reliability of the letter is highly questionable. Nergal-Shara-Baladan claimed that he marched across the desert to the cities of Ashkelon, Ekron, Gath, Jabneh, Jamnia, and all the way to the Egyptian border, but he met little resistance, suggesting that the region was probably just terrorized by his reputation alone. He also claimed to have campaigned against the Cypriots, the kingdom of Aram Cilicia, the land of the Philistines, Moab, Ammon, and Judah. According to the Book of Kings, Nergal-Shara-Baladan campaigned against the Jews 3 times during his reign. During his first campaign, he led an army to the city of Lachish, located near Jerusalem, where he lived for several months while he unsuccessfully laid siege to the city. After failing to capture Lachish, he turned his attention to Jerusalem, where he also failed to capture the city. It was during this siege that the Jews gained the upper hand over the Babylonians for the first time in the war. The siege lasted for 5 years before Nergal-Shar-Baladon gave up and returned to Babylon. During the early 540s BCE, the throne of Babylon had passed to a new ruler, Cyrus the Great, who would go on to found the Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus was interested in expanding his empire, and he would conquer Lydia and Media, bringing them under the rule of the Babylonians. It seems that Nergal-Shar-Baladon wanted to prove himself to the new king and win back some respect for the Babylonian army. As such, he led another campaign into Judah. This time, he made swift progress and captured many cities, including Jerusalem, forcing the Jewish people to flee into the desert. He also plundered the temple in Jerusalem, stole the sacred vessels, and deported many of the Jewish elite to Babylon. The tone of the Babylonian Chronicle suggests that this was seen as a great victory for Nergal-Shar-Baladon, as it was the first time that the Jews were driven out of their territory. However, the Jewish people were able to regroup in the wilderness and form guerrilla bands that would harass the Babylonians whenever they came out of their fortified cities. This proved to be a problem for Nergal-Shar-Baladon, as his supply lines were constantly threatened. This may have been part of the reason that he decided to launch a third and final campaign into Judea. He led his forces south to the city of Elusa, located in Edom, where he built a fort and left a garrison. Then he returned north and besieged Jerusalem once again. We don't know how long the siege lasted, but it must have been long enough for Nergal-Shar-Baladon to become impatient. In a letter to Esarhaddon, he boasted that he was able to capture Jerusalem without even attacking the city. According to Nergal-Shar-Baladon, the Jews simply surrendered, and he was able to plunder the city without resistance. However, this claim should be taken with a grain of salt, given his track record for exaggerating his victories. After finishing his campaign in Jerusalem, Nergal-Shar-Baladon returned to his capital, Babylon, where he died shortly after. During his reign, the Babylonians had proven to be a formidable force against the Jews, able to devastate their armies and capture their cities. However, the Jewish people were resilient and were able to survive the Babylonian onslaught. Ultimately, it seemed that neither side was able to achieve a decisive victory during this period of the war. As such, it seemed as though the conflict between the Jews and the Babylonians would only intensify in the coming years. Make sure to stay tuned for more episodes in this series, including episodes covering major battles and figures from the war. Let me know in the comments below if you'd like to see other conflicts covered in this format. Thanks for watching. Every December, a massive global transformation takes place. From New York to Tokyo, London to Jakarta, the world is painted in shades of red and green. Billions of people prepare for a day we call Christmas. But if we peel back the layers of this tradition, we find a historical labyrinth that is dark, complex, and filled with contradictions. Have you ever wondered why we celebrate the birth of a Middle Eastern prophet with pine trees from the frozen north? Why do we tell stories of a jolly fat man flying with reindeer? And most importantly, why was December 25th chosen when the Bible itself never mentions a date? Today, we aren't just looking at Christmas as a religious holiday. We are dissecting it as a socio-political phenomenon. We will journey back to the wild days of ancient Rome, see how emperors used this day for power, discover how Puritans in America once banned Christmas under threat of imprisonment, and see how the Industrial Revolution and a soda company created the face of Christmas we know today. This is the complete narrative of how humanity fights the darkness of winter with light, noise, and a bit of historical engineering. Grab your coffee or hot cocoa, because this is a 2,000-year journey. To understand Christmas, we must temporarily forget about churches or presents. We must go back to the most primal human need, survival. In the Northern Hemisphere, winter was once a death sentence. Famine, total darkness, and extreme cold were the ultimate enemies. Every year there is a moment called the winter solstice. It is the day the sun is at its southernmost point, resulting in the shortest day and the longest night. For ancient people, this was a crisis. Would the sun keep disappearing and leave us in darkness forever? Or would it return? In Rome, this turning point was celebrated with Saturnalia. Starting December 17th and lasting 7 days, this wasn't a quiet celebration. It was a world upside-down festival dedicated to Saturn, the god of agriculture. During Saturnalia, Roman law was essentially suspended. Businesses and schools closed. Slaves were given temporary freedom. They were allowed to wear their master's clothes, sit at the head of the table, and their masters would serve them food. It was a way for Roman society to release social steam. They also had a tradition of gift-giving called sigillaria. People exchanged candles as symbols of light or clay dolls. In the streets, people shouted Io Saturnalia. It was loud, filled with alcohol, and far from the holy image we have today. Moving north to the land of the Norse and the Vikings, they celebrated Yule. Winter there was far more brutal than in Italy. During Yule, men would bring home a massive tree trunk called a Yule log. They would set it on fire, and the feast would last as long as the log burned, usually about 12 days. Every spark from the burning Yule log was seen as a sign of luck for the new cattle to be born in the spring. This is the root of the 12 days of Christmas. They also brought evergreens into their homes, firs, holly, and mistletoe. Why? Because in the middle of deadly snow, these plants stayed green. They were seen as having magical power over life. Now, let's tackle the most sensitive question. If Jesus was born, when was he actually born? If we read the Gospel of Luke, it says shepherds were watching their flocks in the fields at night. In Bethlehem, December is the peak of the cold, rainy season. It is highly unlikely shepherds would be out in the open fields at night during that month. Most historians and theologians agree that Jesus was likely born in the spring or summer. So, how did the date December 25th emerge? It's a combination of theological math and genius political strategy. In the early centuries, Christians didn't really care about birthdays. To them, the day of death, martyrdom, was far more important. However, by the 3rd century, a need arose to establish a birth date for the Messiah. There is a theory called the calculation theory. Some early theologians believed Jesus was crucified on March 25th. In ancient tradition, there was a belief that great men died on the same day they were conceived. If Jesus was conceived on March 25th, then 9 months later falls on December 25th. But there was a more pragmatic reason. In the 4th century, the Roman Empire began adopting Christianity. The problem? The common people were very reluctant to give up their beloved Saturnalia and the sole Invictus unconquered sun. Festival on December 25th. Pope Julius I realized that banning a popular festival was a political suicide mission. So, around 350 AD, he officially designated December 25th as the day to celebrate Christ's birth. This was syncretism. The church didn't delete the People's Party. They just rebranded it. They turned the worship of the physical sun into the worship of the light of the world in the form of Jesus. If you think medieval Christmas was a quiet time for prayer, you are mistaken. During this era, Christmas was a blend of church service and a chaotic street carnival. This was the era of the Lord of Misrule. In England and France, there was a tradition where a commoner or a servant was chosen as the King of Christmas, or the Lord of Misrule. His role, to lead the chaos. People would wear strange costumes, swap clothes between men and women, and dance loudly in the streets. They would go to the homes of the wealthy and demand the best food and liquor. It was a form of social tax in the winter. If the homeowner refused, the revelers wouldn't hesitate to vandalize doors or windows. The classic carol "We Wish You a Merry Christmas" actually has a threatening tone in its original lyrics. We won't go until we get some. The church was in a difficult position. They wanted holiness, but they needed the people's loyalty. Thus, the church often allowed this chaos for a few days as a social catharsis before the people returned to the period of fasting and hard work in the spring. Christmas history almost ended in the 17th century. A radical Christian movement emerged called the Puritans. They wanted to cleanse religion of anything not in the Bible and anything that smelled pagan or Catholic. In England, Oliver Cromwell and his Parliament officially banned Christmas in 1644. They saw it as a heathen festival of drunkenness. Shops were required to stay open on December 25th, and churches were ordered to close. Even cooking a special Christmas meal could get you arrested. The same happened in America. In Massachusetts, from 1659 to 1681, anyone caught celebrating Christmas in any way was fined 5 shillings. For the American Puritans, Christmas was a symbol of the European decadence they had left behind. It took a long time for Christmas to become legal again on American soil. The Christmas we know today, warm, family-focused, and compassionate, is actually a product of the 19th century. There were 2 main factors: literature and the royal family. In 1843, Charles Dickens wrote a short novella titled A Christmas Carol. At the time, England was suffering through the Industrial Revolution. Children worked in factories, and poverty was rampant. Dickens created the character Ebenezer Scrooge to criticize greed. Through this book, Dickens effectively changed the focus of Christmas. From a wild street party, it became a moment of humanity. He emphasized the importance of sharing, feeding the poor, and gathering with family. Many historians call Dickens the man who invented Christmas. At the same time, Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert, brought a tradition from his homeland, Germany, to England. The Christmas tree in 1848. An illustration of the royal family standing in front of a decorated evergreen appeared in the newspaper. Because Queen Victoria was the ultimate celebrity, the whole world, including America, immediately copied the tradition. Finally, we must discuss the icon, Santa Claus. His name comes from the Dutch Sinterklaas, which refers to Saint Nicholas. Nicholas was a bishop in Myra, now Turkey, in the 4th century. He was known for his extreme generosity. The most famous story is when he threw bags of gold through the window of a poor family so their daughters wouldn't be sold into slavery. Nicholas was a symbol of pure Christian charity. However, the face of Santa we know today, the fat man in a red suit with a white beard and a sleighs, a product of 19th century American culture. Clement Clarke Moore's 1823 poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, gave Santa his reindeer and the ability to enter through chimneys. There is a myth that Coca-Cola invented Santa. That's not entirely true. However, in 1931, Coca-Cola hired illustrator Haddon Sundblom to draw Santa for their winter ad campaigns. Sundblom made Santa look incredibly friendly, jolly, and human. Because of Coca-Cola's massive distribution, this image became the global standard. So, after this 2,000-year journey, what can we conclude? Christmas is a mosaic. It contains pieces of ancient astronomy, Roman pagan festivals, Viking log-burning traditions, early Christian theology, and modern marketing strategy. It may be true that the date is not historically accurate. It may be true that many of its symbols come from outside the religion. But the history of Christmas tells us something very deep about humans. We cannot live without hope. In the middle of the darkest night, in the middle of the biting winter, humans have always found a reason to light a candle, share food with a neighbor, and believe that tomorrow will be brighter. Christmas, in all its forms and evolutions, is a celebration of the resilience of the human spirit. Thank you for watching this long-form documentary. If you learned something new today, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. What's your favorite or weirdest Christmas tradition? Let me know in the comments. I am Redja Production, and I'll see you in the next historical exploration. Stay curious. Imagine a war so vast, so influential, that it formed the very bedrock of Western literature. A 10-year conflict sparked by forbidden love, led by power-hungry kings, and colored by the interference of the gods of Olympus. We are talking about the Trojan War. For centuries, the story of the fall of Troy was considered mere fable. But behind the poetic epic verses, is there a trace of a real conflict that we can scientifically prove? Today, we will journey through time, from the ancient texts of Homer to modern excavation sites in Turkey. We will dissect the myths, analyze the archaeological evidence, and dig into academic journals to find the truth behind the legend of the wooden horse. Prepare for a story far more complex and fascinating than you ever thought. Our primary source is the epic poems attributed to Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, which are estimated to have been written down in the 8th century BC, though they are based on a much older oral tradition. The Iliad is not the complete story of the war. It only covers about 51 days in the 10th year of the siege, with its main focus on the wrath of Achilles after his dispute with King Agamemnon. Other crucial parts come from the epic cycle, a series of poems that are now mostly lost. But they provide details about events before and after the Iliad, including the story of the Trojan horse, which was later recounted by Virgil in the Aeneid. It's important to underline that while these are our narrative sources, historians categorize them as mythology, with a historical kernel. These texts are a reflection of the culture, religion, and worldview of Mycenaean Greek society and later periods. The mythological trigger for the war is a classic, the wedding feast of Peleus and Thetis, where the uninvited goddess Eris discord through a golden apple. The decision of Paris, a Trojan prince, to give the apple to Aphrodite, who promised him the most beautiful woman, Helen, was the beginning of the catastrophe. Helen's abduction or elopement from her husband, Menelaus, the king of Sparta, violated the sacred law of Xenia hospitality, and the oath of Tyndareus, where all of Helen's suitors swore to defend her marriage. This turned a personal conflict into a military obligation for all the Greek Achaean kings, led by Agamemnon, the king of Mycenae. However, modern historians suspect the real motives were likely economic and political. Troy was located in a highly strategic position near the Dardanelles Strait Hellespont, a vital gateway to the Black Sea. Controlling this strait meant controlling lucrative trade routes. The 10-year war was dominated by duels and grand battles. On the Trojan side, there was Hector, the guardian star of the city, a flawless hero. On the Greek side, there was Achilles, the greatest warrior, accompanied by his cousin and closest friend, Patroclus. The climax of the Iliad is Achilles' vengeful fight against Hector after Hector killed Patroclus. The defeat and death of Hector marked a moral and strategic devastation for Troy, even though their walls still stood firm. Achilles himself was eventually killed by an arrow shot by Paris, guided by Apollo, which struck his heel, his only weak spot. These stories are not just about battles, but also about the heroic code, arrate, and inevitable fate. The gods actively intervened, showcasing the ancient worldview where nature and divine destiny were tightly interwoven with human fate. After 10 years of stalemate, the winner was decided by cunning, not strength. Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, devised the strategy of the wooden horse. The giant horse was positioned as an offering to the goddess Athena. After the Greeks had seemingly given up, this story was supported by Sinon, a Greek spy who convinced the Trojans. Stern warnings from Laocoon and his daughter Cassandra were ignored. Laocoon was even killed by 2 sea serpents, an omen misinterpreted as the god's wrath against him. Under the cover of darkness, Troy, lost in celebration, was destroyed from within. Virgil describes this horrific destruction in detail in the Aeneid, telling how the Greek soldiers leaped out, opened the gates, and burned the city. The truth of the Trojan War shifted from fiction to fact in the 19th century. Heinrich Schliemann, a businessman and amateur archaeologist, was determined to find Troy and succeeded in excavating the hill of Hisarlik in northwestern Turkey in the 1870s. At Hisarlik, the ruins of a stacked city were discovered, indicating 9 settlement periods: Troy, I2 Troy, Ix. The layer most likely connected to Homer's war is Troy via. Why Troy via first? The timing. This layer is dated to around 1250 to 1150 BC, fitting the historical estimate of the Trojan War around the 13th–12th century BC. This chronology aligns with the collapse of Bronze Age civilizations in the Mediterranean. Second, the destruction. Troy via shows evidence of sudden destruction by fire and warfare, with unburied human remains and weapon finds. Third, population evidence. The fortress shows signs of defense and resource limitations typical of a besieged city. This discovery proved that a Mycenaean-era city was destroyed at the same location as Troy in Homer's epic. The Trojan War was most likely a distorted and embellished oral memory of a real conflict that occurred during the Bronze Age transition. For credibility, we must turn to modern scientific analysis. Archaeologists like Manfred Kaufmann, who led post-Schliemann excavations at Hisarlik, argue that Troy was a much larger and more important trading city than previously imagined. The most crucial scientific evidence comes from sources outside of Greece and Troy. In Anatolia, we have records from the Hittites, a major civilization east of Troy. Hittite documents from the 14th to 13th centuries BC often mention a region called Wilusa. Many scholars, including Joachim Latach, believe that Wilusa is the historical name for Troy, and there was a king named Alexandru of Wilusa, who might be the equivalent of Alexandros, another name for Paris. Hittite records also mention a powerful state called Ahiawa, widely believed to be the equivalent of Achaea, Homer's term for the Greeks. Hittite correspondence tells of disputes and conflicts between Wilusa and Ahiawa. By combining Homer's epic, the archaeological destruction of Troy via, and the political records from the Hittite Empire, we see a compelling picture. The Trojan War was not pure fiction, but an epic reflection of Bronze Age geopolitical conflict between Mycenaean Greece and Western Anatolia. The Trojan War was a battle won twice, once on the battlefield by Odysseus's deceit, and a second time in the realm of eternity by Homer's pen. This legend teaches us about hubris, fate, and the price of conflict. It reminds us that behind the stories of heroes and gods, there is always a harsh historical reality: burned cities, collapsed empires, and lost lives. Although we may never know the exact details of how Helen and Paris met, or how many soldiers hid inside the Trojan horse, we know this: Troy existed, a war happened, and its stories will live forever. What is the most fascinating part of the Trojan War for you? Write a comment and let's discuss this timeless historical puzzle. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more credible historical explorations. See you in the next video. The Samnite Wars were a series of conflicts between Rome and various Italian peoples during the 4th century BC. But most military historians focus almost exclusively on the first two Samnite Wars, in which the Romans defeated their opponents decisively and extended their influence throughout central Italy. However, there was still one more war to come, the Third Samnite War, which ended up being the most violent and the longest out of all three and took no less than 8 years to complete. Moreover, this conflict was also far from straightforward, since it did not feature just the Romans and the Samnites alone, but also several other Italian peoples, like the Etruscans, and even the Greek colonies of southern Italy. So let's talk about the Third Samnite War, also called the War of the Italian Confederacy, an epic struggle over the region of Campania that lasted from 343 to 341 BC. At the end of the previous century, the Samnite tribes had waged a desperate war against the expanding power of Rome and had been defeated by the Roman dictator Camillus, who died in 345 BC. His successor, the consul Lucius Furius, decided to take advantage of the situation and conquer the fertile region of Campania. In fact, the Samnites were merely the junior partners in this war, since the real opposition to Rome came from the Lucanians, the Bruti and the Etruscans, who formed a formidable alliance with the Their combined armies repeatedly defeated the Romans, capturing even the consul Gaius Julius Caesar at the Vulcinus River, and when the reinforcements arrived under the command of Lucius Papirus Cursor, he too was forced to flee. These defeats caused panic in Rome, and the Romans pleaded with King Artulus III of Epirus to send his brother, the famous General Pyrrhus, to rescue them. But before we continue, a quick reminder for those who are new here. In the meantime, the Romans, eager to turn the tide of the war in their favor, made a crucial decision. They abandoned their initial plan to campaign in Samnium and Lucania, and instead chose to invade. This move proved successful as they defeated the Etruscans decisively at the Battle of the Chiara Valley River, forcing them to withdraw into their fortified cities. Rome then laid siege to these cities, capturing several of them, including Veii, where they discovered vast stores of supplies left behind by the Etruscans, enabling Rome to sustain its war efforts. Meanwhile, Pyrrhus arrived in Italy with his army, and the allies of Rome were ecstatic upon his arrival. However, he didn't live up to their expectations, winning only a single battle against the Samnites, the Battle of the Ceriswa. You may ask, well, mainly because Pyrrhus fought with an army of mercenaries, rather than with citizen soldiers. You see, the people of Epirus were quite short in stature, so much so that even the heavy infantry were considered light troops. And while the Epirote phalanx was tactically superior to the hoplite formations of the ancient Greeks, it was no match for the disciplined and heavily armed Roman legionaries. Additionally, Rome's strategic decision to supply grain to its troops from the captured Etruscan stores ensured that they never suffered from hunger or attrition due to lack of food. However, despite these setbacks, Pyrrhus continued to fight alongside the Romans until 341 BC, when he returned home after suffering serious losses. In fact, Pyrrhus would later lament the dire straits of his army, saying that if he had one more victory, he would be ruined. Still, thanks to Pyrrhus, the Romans managed to stabilize the front lines and buy time to regroup and devise a new strategy, and soon the tide of the war turned again, albeit not in Rome's favor. The Samnites managed to defeat the Roman legate Gnaeus Domitius, and even laid siege to the important city of Ess. But the Romans refused to surrender and managed to repel the attack, killing the Samnite general or Occasado in the process. Enraged by their failure to capture Ess, the Samnites slaughtered the inhabitants of a nearby Roman colony, Frigile, and marched on Rome's ally, Naples, which was defended by the Roman general Quintus Publius. The Neapolitans had built a wall around the city's harbor to protect themselves from pirates, but that same wall now hindered their attempts to bring in supplies. With the city under siege, Publius Philo appealed to Rome for aid, and in response, 2 legions were dispatched under the command of Lucius Papirius Cursor. Meanwhile, the Lucanians were causing havoc across southern Italy. They had defeated the Romans in many battles and even managed to lay siege to In response, the Tarentines called upon the help of their allies, the Spartans and the Greek colonies of southern Italy, who sent reinforcements to defend the city. In the end, the invaders were forced to retreat after inflicting heavy casualties on the Lucanian cavalry at the Battle of the Brentis River. And in the north, the Roman dictator Lucius Furius Camillus was trying to subdue the Etruscans once and for all. He had already captured several key cities, including Populonia, Roselle, and Volterra, and was now preparing to lay siege to the last remaining independent Etruscan city. But before he could do so, news arrived that the Samnites had broken through the Roman defenses and were marching on Rome. Camillus was forced to abandon his campaign in Etruria and rush to the defense of the city. As the Samnite army approached, they established a camp near the Porta Metronia, ready to lay siege to the city. But their hopes for a quick victory were dashed when the Romans, led by the consul Titus Manlius, the Samnites were completely routed, losing their baggage and standards. And while the Romans pursued them as far as their camp, they refrained from storming it, respecting the sanctity of the Samnite customs and beliefs. Instead, they gave them time to collect their belongings and then allowed them to depart. This leniency in fueling their determination to exact revenge and sack Rome. But in the meantime, Torquatus was preparing for the long siege that lay ahead. He strengthened the city's fortifications and built fortifications outside the city walls to accommodate the expected influx of refugees. To ensure the city's defense, he stationed 3 legions and 4 auxiliary cohorts near the Porta Metronia, positioned to more legions along the Via Nimentana, and placed the elite troops under the command of his son, Titus Manlius. One day, the Samnites attacked in force, aiming to breach the city gates, but they were repelled with heavy losses, which only fueled their desire for revenge. During the night, a group of 200 Samnites infiltrated the city and set fire to the outer defenses. However, they were discovered and driven away by the Roman cavalry, who also captured some of their weapons. The Romans retaliated by launching a nocturnal attack on the Samnites, but they too were beaten back. Nevertheless, the Romans were undeterred and prepared for a new assault. They divided their forces into 3 columns, each tasked with breaching one of the 3 main gates. The Samnites anticipated this move and concentrated their forces near the Porta Metronia, expecting the Romans to strike there. However, the Roman commander, Lucius Papirius, launched a surprise attack near the Porta San Sebastiano and broke through the enemy lines. With the gates breached, the Roman infantry stormed in, engaged the Samnite defenders, and quickly overwhelmed them. The Samnites were defeated and fled towards the hills, abandoning this, and thus the Third Samnite War came to an end with a decisive Roman victory. As the Samnite allies grew weaker, Rome had triumphed over all its enemies, securing peace and prosperity for itself and its allies. In the aftermath of the war, Rome emerged as the dominant power in central and southern Italy, establishing control over the regions of Campania. It also gained the allegiance of the Etruscans, who became Roman allies. The Romans generously rewarded their soldiers for their service, granting them land, money, and glory. The Roman Senate elevated the common soldier to the status of an aristocrat, ensuring that the wealth seized from conquered territories flowed directly into the hands of the citizenry. Rome's victories during the period between 343 and 327 BC transformed the city into a true Mediterranean power. marking a significant turning point in its early history. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video. Hey everybody, thank you so much for joining me for another installment of Sacred War Chronicles. It's been a while since we last spoke. As always, I hope this finds you well, wherever in the world you may be. Wherever you are, I hope that your day is filled with peace. In today's video, we're going to talk about a minor event in the pantheon of human history, a battle which will determine the fate of humanity, or at least, that's what some would have you believe. I'm talking about the Battle of Caransebe's, between the armies of Rome and those of the Germanic tribes, and it would take place in the year 275 AD. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an upload. And if you enjoy these historical tales, please consider supporting us through the provided means. If you're already familiar with this period of history, then you know that Rome was in trouble. The empire was being pushed to its limits by the constant pressure from outside invaders, and now it seems that the gods themselves were abandoning them. Just a few years prior to 275 AD, the god Apollo had sent his oracle at Delphi into a prophetic coma after being enraged by the Roman emperor. His decision to allow paganism to be practiced freely within the empire, that would come back to bite Rome shortly. Because without the guidance of the Oracle of Delphi, the Romans would lose one key battle after another. Even though they still had plenty of military victories during this time, there was something different about these times. Something that made every victory feel hollow. Rome was losing the support of their gods, and the enemy knew it. The Germanic tribes had managed to push deep into Roman territory, pillaging and burning everything in their path. And now they were closing in on the city of Delphi itself, which was considered sacred ground. If they took Delphi, it would practically be a death sentence for the Roman Empire. So naturally, Emperor Aurelian decided to march his army up north to deal with the situation. His goal was twofold. He wanted to put down this rebellion once and for all, and he also hoped that by doing so, he could rekindle the favor of the gods and restore their guidance through the oracle. The first thing you need to understand about the Battle of Caransebe's is that it didn't happen in a vacuum. We couldn't just pop into existence in the middle of a battle without first understanding the events that led up to it. For the past decade, Rome had been dealing with an influx of Germanic tribes pouring into the empire. This was due to the growing power of the Goths, who were pushing other tribes out of their lands. These displaced tribes had no choice but to flee south into Roman territory, and they brought with them a taste for Roman blood. At first, Rome tried to handle this problem by making deals with the tribes, letting them settle in certain areas of the empire in exchange for their loyalty. But that didn't work out very well, because the Germanic tribes soon began raiding into Roman territory, stealing their treasure and, most importantly, taking their women and children as slaves. By the mid-70s, the situation was so bad that Emperor Aurelian decided he needed to do something drastic. He assembled a massive army and marched north to teach these barbarians a lesson they wouldn't forget. When news of Aurelian's invasion reached the ears of King Bagay of the Goths, he knew that he was in trouble. The Germanic tribes had never been united like this before, and now their chance of survival was hanging by a thread. So he did what any good leader would do. He gathered his allies and prepared to fight. As Aurelian's troops moved north, they quickly found themselves in the midst of a hornet's nest. The Germanic tribes were waiting for them, and they weren't afraid to show it. The first engagement between the two forces occurred at the river Cistern, and it was a disaster for the Romans. The Germanic tribes fought with the ferocity of cornered animals, and the Romans were pushed back to the city of Sirmium. Inside Sirmium, Aurelian regrouped his troops and prepared for the next battle. When the Germanic tribes attacked again, the Romans were ready for them. The battle was long and bloody, But in the end, the Romans prevailed. But this victory was short-lived, because not long after, the Germanic tribes attacked again, and this time they broke through the Roman lines and captured. Now Aurelian had to escape through a secret passageway beneath the city walls. This was a humiliating defeat for Rome, and it seemed that the Germanic tribes were unstoppable. But Aurelian was not done fighting yet. He realized that the only way to defeat the Germanic tribes was to strike at their leader Bagae. So he marched his army to the city of Caransebe's, where Bagae was staying. The siege of Caransebe's was one of the longest and bloodiest sieges in Roman history. It lasted for months, and both sides suffered greatly. But in the end, the Romans prevailed, and Bagae was forced to flee. This was a turning point in the war. With their leader gone, the Germanic tribes were in chaos. They couldn't mount any serious attacks on the Romans, and eventually they were forced to sue for peace. Now that the immediate threat had been taken care of, Aurelian could turn his attention to Delphi. The oracle had been silent for years, and it was vital to Rome that they restore her guidance. So he assembled a new army and marched to Delphi. When the Roman army arrived at Delphi, they were met by a small force of Germanic tribes. The Romans were outnumbered, but they were also much better equipped and trained. The battle was over quickly, and the Germans were routed. This was a great victory for the Romans, and it seemed that their troubles were finally over. But this was not the case. You see, while the Battle of Caransebe's was a decisive victory for the Romans, it came at a cost. The Roman army was severely depleted in numbers, and they were unable to follow up on their victory. In fact, they were lucky to even get back to Rome at all. The Germanic tribes regrouped and launched a counterattack, and Rome was in trouble once again. And so the war continued on in much the same way. Rome won a battle, then lost a battle, then won a battle, then lost a battle. It seemed like neither side could get the upper hand. It wasn't until 4 years later that the situation finally came to a head. In 279, a Gothic king named Bursis marched his army into Roman territory and laid siege to the city of This was too much for Rome. They had lost the support of their gods, and now it seemed like their enemies were out to destroy them once and for all. So the Romans did something desperate. They turned to the gods of the Germanic tribes for help. They offered the Goths generous terms, and in exchange, the Goths called off the siege and allowed the Romans to keep their treasure. This treaty ended the war, but it didn't bring Rome any closer to solving their problems. They still didn't have the Oracle of Delphi, and they were still being harassed by the Germanic tribes. And so it was that Rome entered into a long period of decline. They lost their power, their wealth, and eventually their very existence. It's a sad end for such a great empire, but it is a reminder that even the greatest of empires can fall if they do unlearn from their mistakes. If you enjoyed this video, then you'll love the series I'm working on about the fall of Rome. It is already in production and should be released sometime in early 2023. I hope you check it out when it comes out. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, then please do so, you'll never miss an upload. And if you enjoyed this video, then please consider supporting us through the provided means. We've got lots of cool stuff planned for the future, and your support would mean the world to us. Until next time, my friends, stay safe and stay educated. Philip II of Macedon was the man who made the ancient Greeks invincible in war and the greatest threat to the Persian Empire. He conquered Greece and forged the Greek city-states into an unstoppable war machine that even Rome would envy. But he's not exactly a household name. You might know him as the father of Alexander the Great, but his son is almost too great to be talked about. If we ignore Philip, there is this whole dynasty of Macedonian rulers who unified Greece under one king and helped spread Greek culture all over the known world. Let's talk about Philip II, the architect of Hellenic domination. Philip II came to power in the year 359 BC in the Kingdom of Macedonia. Now remember back to those videos we did about Greece in general and Athens in particular. I told you how it was a bunch of independent city-states with no real unity among them. Well, Macedon wasn't part of that group for two very good reasons. First, they were a monarchy instead of a city, and second, they were more militarized than anyone else in Greece. Macedon was considered kind of a backwater kingdom by the rest of Greece. They weren't really a cultural powerhouse like Athens or Sparta. So if Philip wanted to leave his mark on history, he knew he had to do something big. The thing about being a small fry in a big pond is everyone thinks you're pretty insignificant. So when Philip's father died and Philip took the throne, he had a lot of people to prove wrong. His neighbors, the Illyrians, were causing trouble, so Philip recruited some mercenaries and crushed them. This showed every other Greek state that Macedon was a force to be reckoned with. It also gave Philip the manpower to march south against the city-states of Greece. Now, the big problem Philip had was that while Greece was relatively easy pickings, he didn't have enough soldiers to conquer the entire region at once. So he went after the weak states first and steadily built up his power base. After a few years of fighting, he turned his attention to Thebes. Why? Because Thebes was a major nuisance. They had become the champions of federalism for the Greek cities, and they used their influence to make a bunch of allies and annoy the living hell out of Philip. Remember the Battle of Leuctra that I mentioned in the last episode? Well, Theban General Epaminondas was there, and it was his idea to have a sacred band of 150 pairs of gay male lovers who fought together in battle. Philip wanted to smash that. Philip marched north and laid siege to the city, but he found it was well defended, so he lifted the siege and went home. A few years later, he tried again and got the same result. On the third try, though, he finally captured Thebes and made it pay dearly for its resistance. At this point, most of Greece was either directly under Macedonian control or heavily influenced by Philip. The only serious holdouts left were Sparta and Athens. Now, Philip could have kept marching south and trying to finish the job, but he had another problem. To the east of Macedon was the vast and terrifying Persian Empire, and Philip was getting messages from the Persian king saying that if Philip kept taking land, the Persians might just invade Greece themselves. And honestly, Philip didn't want to fight the Persians. So what he did instead was reach out to these minor states on the border and make alliances with them. Then he took his show on the road and started conquering cities along the coast of Asia Minor. The Persian king was furious and sent his army to stop Philip's advance. In the year 338 BC, the two armies met at the Battle of Granicus River, and let me tell you, this was a big, messy affair. In total, it was almost certainly the bloodiest day in ancient Greek history before the Battle of Actium. In the end, Philip's mercenaries proved too much for the Persians. Philip lost a shitload of men, but the rest of his army was intact and the Persian king was dead. This victory put Philip on the map as the most powerful ruler in the Mediterranean. It also established Macedonian supremacy over the Aegean Sea. From this point on, the Mediterranean would be a place where the navies of Macedonia and Carthage would battle for supremacy, just like Rome and Carthage would 2 centuries later. By this time, most of Greece was either under Philip's direct control or so frightened of Philip that they became client states of Macedon. The only significant exception was Sparta, and they didn't last long. Philip easily defeated them and subjugated them to the Macedonian war machine. By this point, he had been king for 27 years. His reign was the longest of any Macedonian king. Up to that point, he was the most successful general in ancient Greek history. He had crushed Thebes, defeated the Persians and humbled Sparta. It seemed nothing could stop him, and then he pissed out the Oracle of Delphi. Here's the thing about oracles. In ancient Greece, they were hot. Everyone wanted their prophecies, and lots of leaders based their foreign policy around them. But here's the other thing about oracles. They get weirded out, really is. Back in the days when I was studying classics, one of my professors, Father Malachi Stackpole, always said, "Don't trust an oracle unless you can trust Zeus." That's because the god who delivered the message through the Oracle of Delphi was Apollo. Apollo was moody and prone to whim, and he was really sensitive about people insulting him. So Philip thought he would be clever and insult Apollo a bit. When he was young, he had this weird growth spurt and got gangly legs. So he went to the Oracle of Delphi to see if she could divine what was going on. She said he would one day rule all the way from the Pillars of Hercules to the sands of Egypt. And then she dropped a little hint that he should maybe dress for his body type. Philip got the message, and he also got a tailor. But he never forgot that insult. He grew up resenting Apollo and everything the god stood for. Now, Philip was a devotee of the god Zeus, who represented sky and thunder, and if you were Greek, you knew you couldn't mess with Zeus. So when Philip decided to build a new temple at Delphi, dedicated to Zeus, everyone thought, okay, that's cool. We love Zeus. But Philip had other plans. His new temple was gonna be so huge that it dwarfed the temple of Apollo that stood there before. He poured every ounce of wealth from his 27 years of conquests into building this new temple. And to ensure it happened fast, he enslaved the entire population of the region and forced them to work as slave labor. It was at about this time that the Oracle of Delphi started having visions of a terrible destroying the earth and sky. When her priests relayed this message to Philip, he figured, hey, sounds like me. And that's when his luck ran out. Philip had been stabbed to death by one of his own bodyguards. The person who ordered the hit was probably Philip's wife, Olympias, who had a thing for throwing people off balconies. But that's a story for another day. When Philip was killed, he left behind an empire that stretched from Greece all the way to the borders of Persia. The city-states of Greece were now united under the rule of a single king, which meant that Philip created the first Hellenic superpower. The biggest beneficiary of Philip's work was his son, Alexander the Great. He inherited an empire that was ready to go to war with the Persians and take over the entire eastern Mediterranean. Without his father's efforts, Alexander might not have been able to do anything more than rule Macedon itself. As it was, he inherited his father's personal army of 20,000 elite infantrymen, a navy strong enough to challenge the Persians at sea, and a web of alliances that stretched all across Greece. Philip also set up a system of roads throughout his empire, so his generals could travel quickly and raise armies fast. Most importantly, Philip established the idea that kings of Macedon were the divinely appointed heads or leaders of all Greece. It was a concept that Alexander ran with and turned into a personal religion. So remember when I said at the beginning that Philip wasn't a household name? Well, I lied. He isn't really a household name outside of academia. But within academia, he's pretty damn famous. You know why? Because he is the guy who took Greek civilization out of the Peloponnese and turned it into a Mediterranean power. He is the reason Greece went from a bunch of squabbling city-states into a cohesive civilization capable of taking on the largest empire the world had ever seen. And if you don't think that's pretty damn architectonic, I don't know what to tell you. I hope you enjoyed learning more about Philip II of Macedon. If you did, please follow for more information. And if you want to keep learning about ancient Greece, I'd recommend starting our series on the rise of Athens right here. And if you want to support us even further, check out our support page. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Hello and welcome to my channel. When we think of ancient Greece, many images come to mind. Marble temples, epic battles between good and evil, and men wearing togas and sandals while discussing philosophy in the streets. But what if I told you that the reason we think this way is because of one man? His name was Pericles, and he shaped not only the political system but also the culture of Athens. From 461 to 429 BC, his impact on Athenian society is similar to that of Augustus in Rome, or the Prophet Muhammad in the Middle East. He literally wrote the constitution for the world's first democracy, and then he made Athens the cultural center of Greece, with the construction of the Parthenon and the Acropolis. Without Pericles, we would not have Plato, Aristotle, Socrates, or the Olympics. So let's learn about the life and accomplishments of this great leader. Before we start, I need to say that there are very few reliable sources about Pericles' life. Most of what we know comes from the writings of his rival, Xenophon, so we can never be sure if Pericles was a virtuous leader or an evil dictator. I will try to remain neutral, but please keep in mind that this video is more like a biography than a historical analysis. Anyway, let's begin. Born in 500 BC in Athens, Pericles came from a wealthy aristocratic family called the Since Athens was an oligarchy at the time, only the rich could participate in politics. Thus, Pericles had all the time and resources needed to become the greatest leader of all time. When he grew up, Pericles traveled around the Mediterranean to learn about different political systems. According to Plutarch, he visited Egypt and the Oracle of Delphi. But most historians reject these claims as propaganda. Instead, they believe that Pericles traveled throughout the Aegean Sea, visiting commercial colonies of the In any case, Pericles learned the art of persuasion and public speaking during his travels, which he later used to manipulate people into doing what he wanted. Pericles returned to Athens as a young man and married a rich woman named Agorastocles. This union gave him access to even more power and influence, and he wasted no time putting it to use. Pericles entered politics and quickly became one of the most popular leaders in Athens. The Athenian constitution established that only men born in Athens could be citizens and vote. Slaves, foreigners, and women were excluded from the political process. Even so, citizenship was expanded to include most free adult males who lived in the city. It was during this period that Athens experienced unprecedented economic and cultural growth. Trade flourished, and the city became the cultural capital of Greece. As we have seen, Pericles inherited an oligarchy when he began his political career. Power was concentrated in the hands of a few aristocrats who controlled the government. However, by the end of his career, Athens had become a full democracy. How did this happen? Well, the transformation of Athens into a democracy was a gradual process that began long before Pericles came to power. The first step was taken in 508 BC, when Cleisthenes introduced a new system of representation in the assembly. This reform allowed more citizens to participate in politics, but the rich still had more power than the poor. Pericles took advantage of this situation and formed a political alliance with the middle class, which was gaining more power every day. Together, they carried out a series of reforms that established democracy as the official government of Athens. First, Pericles proposed a law that limited the amount of property a citizen needed to own in order to qualify for public office. This allowed talented men from the middle class to enter politics regardless of their wealth. Second, Pericles reorganized the courts and replaced the Council of 400 with the Council of 500. This reform ensured that no group of citizens could control the government and that decisions would be made by the people. Third, Pericles reformed the army and created a navy. This was necessary to protect Athens from its enemies, especially Sparta. Finally, Pericles introduced a new currency, the Athenian owl. which was used throughout the Mediterranean. This reform facilitated trade and helped to make Athens the cultural center of the Greek world. These reforms were very successful, and Athens became the most powerful city in Greece. However, not everyone benefited from them. While democracy spread throughout the city, slavery also increased. As Athens grew richer, it needed more slaves to work in the fields and workshops. Slaves were imported from all over the Mediterranean, including from conquered territories. Pericles did nothing to stop this trend, and even participated in the conquest of Melos, where he ordered the killing of all the adult males and the enslavement of women and children. Even though Pericles was responsible for some of Athens' greatest achievements, he also made some serious mistakes. One of his biggest blunders was his decision to go to war with Sparta. The result was the Peloponnesian War, which lasted for 27 years and devastated both sides. Pericles knew that Sparta was a powerful military force, but he underestimated their strength. He thought that Athens could win the war easily, because it had the strongest navy in the Aegean Sea. Unfortunately, the war turned out to have Athens' worst nightmares. Sparta was aided by its allies, especially Corinth and Thebes, and Athens suffered terrible defeats. Pericles tried to make peace with Sparta several times, but the Spartans refused to negotiate until Athens was completely defeated. This stalemate lasted for 10 years. During that time, Athens lost much of its territory and population due to famine and disease. The turning point of the war came in for 29 BC. When a plague struck Athens, the disease killed thousands of people, including the general who replaced Pericles was Cleon, a demagogue who continued the war against Sparta. Unlike Pericles, Cleon was a poor man who appealed to the emotions of the citizens rather than their reason. His policies were disastrous, and Athens lost even more territory and prestige. Pericles had hoped to create a just and prosperous state based on reason and moderation, but his successors turned Athens into a reckless and aggressive empire. Now let's talk about Pericles' personal life. He was married twice. His first wife was Agarista, whom he married when he was young. With her, he had 2 sons. After Agarista died, he married another woman named Aspasia, who was a foreigner. It is said that she was very beautiful and intelligent, and that she helped Pericles with his speeches and writings. Some historians claim that Pericles and Aspasia were lovers, but there is no evidence to support this claim. What we do know is that they had a son together named Pericles. The younger. You may wonder why Pericles wasn't married to Aspasia, since same-sex marriage was legal in ancient Athens. The answer is that Athenian law only recognized marriages between men and women. Same-sex marriage was called ephebism, and it was considered a temporary union between a young man and his older lover. Ephebism was common among the Greeks, and it was usually based on mutual attraction and affection. There were no legal or social obligations involved in this type of relationship, and it was not exclusive. A young man could have several lovers at the same time. However, ephebism was not accepted by everyone in Athenian society. Some people, such as the poet Sappho, criticized this practice because they believed that it was unnatural and immoral. Other people, such as the philosopher Plato, saw ephebism as a positive and beneficial institution, because they believed that it helped young men to develop their sexuality and maturity. Pericles was not only a politician, he was also a patron of the arts and sciences. He understood that culture was a powerful tool for influencing people, and he used it to promote Athenian values and interests. For example, he built the famous Parthenon on the Acropolis of Athens, which was a temple dedicated to the goddess Athena. The Parthenon was considered one of the ancient world's 7 wonders, and it housed many masterpieces of sculpture, including the famous Elgin marbles, Pericles also promoted the arts by founding festivals such as the City Dionysia, which was a celebration of theatre and music. These festivals attracted artists and spectators from all over Greece, and they helped to spread Athenian culture and identity. Furthermore, Pericles supported philosophers such as Anaxagoras and who taught new ways of thinking based on reason and logic rather than mythology and tradition. He believed that philosophy could help Athens to become a center of knowledge and wisdom. In conclusion, Pericles was one of the most influential leaders of ancient Athens, shaping its political system and cultural landscape. His legacy lives on through his contributions to democracy, architecture, arts, and philosophy. We can learn from his example by embracing reason, promoting justice, and supporting the arts. Let me know what you thought about Pericles in the comments section below. And don't forget to subscribe for more videos like this. Thanks for watching, and see you next time. In 605 BC, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II conquered the kingdom of Judah and took the Jewish people captive from their land. The great temple of Yahweh was pillaged, the finest treasures taken back to Babylon, and an end put to any hope of independence for the foreseeable future. And yet, exactly 70 years later, in 536 BC, the Persian king Cyrus the Great would liberate the Jews from exile, returning them to Judah and re-establishing their state. So how did Babylon go from being a tyrannical oppressor to liberator within one generation? Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to answer this extraordinary question by exploring how Babylon went from tyrant to liberator in just 70 years. If you enjoy learning about ancient history, then please subscribe. When the Babylonians came into conflict with the kingdom of Judah, they were at the height of their power. Having displaced the Assyrians as the dominant Mesopotamian empire, they were now masters of a vast domain that stretched from the mountains of Iran down to the Arabian Peninsula and from the Aegean Sea to the borders of Egypt. But it was in their treatment of the Jews and their homeland that the Babylonian Empire would earn its infamous reputation. After conquering Judah, Nebuchadnezzar decided the region's fate. He deported the elite class of Jerusalem, including the royal line of David, and replaced them with people loyal to the Babylonian crown. As punishment for their rebellion, he also destroyed the city of Jerusalem and the great temple of Yahweh. But even after these punitive measures, discontented Jews continued to rebel against their oppressors. Finally, in 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar had enough. He marched on Jerusalem a third time, burnt the city again, destroyed more of the temple, and deported even more of the population, including the prophet Ezekiel. A small remnant stayed behind, but their lives were far from ideal. We get our best description of Babylonian rule through the book of Nehemiah, which begins with the Israelites still smarting under the oppressive yoke of their oppressors. In chapter 1, verses 3 to 4, it says, "I sat down and began to weep and mourn over Jerusalem. Then some friends of mine and some of my fellow servants said, 'Why should you not eat and drink and be glad? It's a festive day before the king.' They were all in good spirits and sent me a choice young goat, but I went down to the palace courtyard and sat down in front of the gate. I took the water in a clay jug and threw it into the garden. Then I went on to the wall and inspected it." This wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Over the next 4 years, Nehemiah fixed up the gates and repaired the wall around the city, but his work was far from done. The Babylonian Empire didn't last much longer. In 539 BC, it was conquered by Persia. The famous account comes from the book of Daniel, chapters 5 and 6. And though historians debate the historicity of certain parts of the narrative, there's no doubt that Babylon fell in this time frame. The story goes like this. Belshazzar, the last king of Babylon, hosted a great feast, inviting the nobles of the kingdom, along with their wives and their daughters. At some point in the evening, they began mocking the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And, as judgment, the finger of God wrote on the wall of the palace. Horrified, Belshazzar summoned Daniel, who interpreted the writing as a divine message, foretelling the end of the Babylonian royal line that very night. That same night, while the revelry was still in full swing, an army of Medes and Persians, led by Cyrus the Great, stormed the city, killing Belshazzar and looting the royal palace. But here's where things take a surprising turn. Instead of subjugating the Jews, Cyrus treated them quite well. In fact, he became known as a liberator, allowing the Jews to return to Judah and rebuild their temple. The most famous edict granting them permission is called the Cyrus Cylinder. Traditionally dated to 539 BC, inscribed on the clay cylinder are decrees about a number of topics, including the restoration of temples, the release of slaves, and the right of manumission, and the return of exiles. However, recent scholarship puts the date of this document closer to 509 BC. This would fit better with what the book of Ezra tells us about the Jewish exiles. Ezra chapter 1 verse 1 to 4. Now in the first year of Cyrus king of Persia, that Cyrus, who had been told in the citadel and throughout his whole realm, that there was a remnant of the children of Israel left there, and that they might return and rebuild the temple of Yah, the God of Israel, he sent out a decree, which was carried out with diligence, and he allowed them to return. Thus, the decree of Cyrus, king of Persia, concerning the temple of God, it was made known to all the peoples near and far. And all the kings of the countries commanded all those who had been carried away captive by him to return to their places, every one to his city. And who were you, O king? And let the God of heaven help you, and rebuild the temple of Jerusalem, so that you may have a shrine of prayer for your God. For thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the god of Babylon, has sent me to destroy it, and to overthrow it, and to disperse the inhabitants thereof among the nations, and to be a curse to those who would not allow the restoration of this city. Thus far, all my power and my dominion. Now Cyrus, the Persian, liberates the Jews. Why? Well, there are a few reasons. First, Cyrus had a personal interest in the welfare of the Jews. Second, he wanted to present himself as a liberator to win favor with the God of Israel. Third, he benefited from having a grateful and loyal group of people settled back in Judah. As for the first reason, there's no evidence that Cyrus ever personally persecuted the Jews. In fact, everything we know about his attitude towards the Jews comes from sources that are favorable to Cyrus. Granted, the book of Isaiah does contain a prophecy about a Cyrus who will come out of Media, gather the Jews from their scattered midst, and bring them to their own land. But the exact nature of Cyrus's relationship to the Jews is unclear. Most scholars think Cyrus acted favorably towards the Jews because he respected their God, Yahweh, and there are several stories that could explain his change of heart. One popular idea is that Daniel predicted Cyrus's victory over Babylon, and therefore the future Persian king was indebted to the God of Israel for his success. Another possibility is that Cyrus witnessed the righteous behavior of the Jews during their exile and was won over by their piety. Finally, it's possible that Cyrus's wife, Esther, who was Jewish, had an influence on his decisions. We don't have much information about her, but she was influential enough to save the Jews from genocide when the evil Haman plotted to annihilate them. The story of Esther is itself fascinating, and I highly recommend reading it. Setting aside these stories, it seems that Cyrus admired the monotheism of the Jews, and while there's no evidence that he converted to Judaism, he clearly understood the difference between Yahweh and the gods of Babylon. In fact, he is the first non-Jewish leader that we know of who actually bothered to restore the temple of Yahweh. Our second reason for Cyrus' propaganda, if you will. He liked to present himself as a liberator. When Cyrus conquered Babylon, he immediately issued edicts freeing slaves, restoring property and reuniting families. He may have done this to differentiate himself from the brutal kings of Babylon, like Nebuchadnezzar, who built his empire on conquest and pillage. More than that, though, it seems that Cyrus believed he was doing the will of God when he freed the Jews. Remember the Cyrus cylinder? It reads, "I am Cyrus, king of the world, the anointed of the Lord." He is claiming that Yahweh has appointed him to overthrow the Babylonians and reinstate the Jews in their homeland. Now, whether or not he genuinely believed that Yahweh spoke directly to him is up for debate. But what's clear is that Cyrus wanted to associate himself with the God of Israel, and what better way to do so than to return the Jews to their home and help them rebuild their magnificent temple? Which brings us to our final reason: practicality. Cyrus benefited greatly from having a grateful and loyal group of people settled in Judah. See, Babylon was an extremely diverse empire. It contained people from dozens of different cities and nations. To maintain control over such a diverse population, Cyrus needed allies. The Jews were perfect subjects for him to court. Not only were they numerous, having been increased in population during their time in exile, they were organized, disciplined, and shared a common culture and language. By treating them well, Cyrus could expect their loyalty and support in running his vast empire, and this alliance paid off. After the fall of Babylon, Cyrus ruled over an even larger area than his predecessors ever did, conquering Thrace in the west and parts of Central Asia in the east. To conclude, we must admit that the transition from tyrannical oppressor to liberator was a complicated process, both in reality and in the eyes of the Jews. While Cyrus did allow the Jews to return to Judah and rebuild their temple, the reality of life under the Persians was mixed. For one thing, Cyrus wasn't the only Persian king. His successors weren't as keen on championing the rights of the Jews, and there are several stories in the books of Nehemiah and Esther about anti-Jewish decrees. Furthermore, many Jews never returned to the land of Judah. Some remained in Babylon, and many others settled in the region around the Persian Empire. Still, given the circumstances, the Persian kings were relatively tolerant of the Jews, and allowed them to govern themselves according to their laws. And it's hard to deny that Cyrus deserves credit for turning things around. Through a combination of personal experience, divine revelation, and political he became the liberator of the Jews and a legendary figure in Jewish history. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Be sure to subscribe and leave me a comment. And as always, thanks for watching. The Peloponnesian War was a brutal conflict between two of ancient Greece's most powerful city-states, Athens and Sparta. This week, we're going to decode this war to understand why it happened, how it unfolded, and why it matters. Before we get into the I just want to say a huge thank you to my supporters who have been absolutely amazing in their support for my work. If you too would like to support my work and be credited at the end of videos, then consider becoming a supporter through the link in the description. Okay, first things first. Let's start with a brief overview of the war itself. The Peloponnesian War was fought between two main coalitions: the Delian League led by Athens, and the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta. These two leagues were made up of many other smaller Greek states. While the Peloponnesian League mainly consisted of land-based states, the Delian League was primarily maritime, allowing Athens to dominate the Aegean Sea and its many islands. This control over the sea also allowed Athens to maintain an empire that stretched from the northern shores of the Black Sea all the way down to the Egyptian border. Across this massive empire, Athens collected tribute from these subject states, which it used to build up its navy and fund its war efforts against Sparta. Sparta was threatened by the growing power of Athens. Many Spartans worried that if Athens continued to grow, it might become the hegemon of all of Greece, a position that Sparta had long held. Another point of contention was the presence of Helots in both Athens and Sparta. Helots were the name given to the subjugated peoples that lived in both states. Sparta's Helot population greatly outnumbered its citizens, leading to constant fear of Helot revolts within Sparta. To mitigate this risk, Spartans took every precaution to ensure that Helots would never rise up against them. In contrast, though Athenians saw their Helots as nothing more than property and treated them terribly, Athenian Helots did revolt on several occasions, but Athens was able to put down these rebellions due to its superior military naval power. When news of these rebellions reached Sparta, they were seen as proof that Athens needed to be stopped. If Athens could treat its Helots so poorly and still win, then what is to stop it from doing the same to Sparta or even trying to dominate all of Greece? So, while there were multiple factors that contributed to the outbreak of the war, ultimately Sparta's desire to stop the growth of a potentially dangerous Athenian empire was the primary catalyst for the conflict. With that out of the way, let's get into the meat of the decoding. First off, I think it's important to point out that the Peloponnesian War is usually remembered as one of the greatest wars in ancient history. However, when viewed through the lens of total casualties, it really doesn't rank all that high. For example, in the roughly 30 years that the war was fought, somewhere between 200 and 300,000 people died. For some context, during World War II, an estimated 70 million people died. And even the deadliest war in human history, the Second World War, which lasted only 4 years, resulted in around 150 million deaths. Now, this isn't meant to diminish the Peloponnesian War in any way. The effects of this war were far-reaching and had consequences for nearly every state in Greece. But it is worth pointing out that not every war is automatically significant just because it involves ancient civilizations. Now that we got that out of the way, let us talk about the overall strategy of each side and how it affected the outcome of the war. To do this, I'm going to use a quote from Thucydides, a general from the Delian League, who, after losing the war, gave a speech explaining why his side lost. He said, "Our failure came about not from any failure of arms or strategy or want of good leadership on our part, but from the mistakes of those who were our allies." In this statement, Thucydides is saying that the reason Athens lost the war wasn't because of anything they did wrong, but rather because of the actions of their allies. In order to understand what he means, we need to look at how each side prepared for war. Athens knew that it was at a strategic disadvantage compared to Sparta. As I mentioned earlier, the Peloponnesian League had a large army, while the Delian League had a strong navy. Since the Spartans were also better fighters on land than the Athenians were, Athens knew that fighting head-on would likely result in defeat. Because of this, Athens chose to try and starve Sparta out by blockading its allies. By cutting off food and supplies to Sparta, Athens hoped that it would be able to weaken the Spartan resolve to fight. Unfortunately for Athens, though Sparta was well prepared for a siege, unlike Athens, which was built on the coast, Sparta was nestled away in the interior of the Peloponnese, making it very difficult for any potential invaders to lay siege to the city. Furthermore, Spartans were accustomed to living a hard life, and they were confident that they could endure whatever hardships Athens might throw their way. As it turned out, the Athenians did manage to blockade the Spartans for a few years, but eventually Sparta was able to find alternative trade routes and sustain itself. Athens had hoped that the Spartans would buckle first, but it ended up being the other way around. Another big difference between the two sides was how they approached diplomacy. Remember, Sparta wasn't the only major power in Greece. There were also the Thebans and the Corinthians, both of whom had reasons to want the Athenians gone. Athens knew that it didn't have enough power to take on Sparta alone, so it tried to make alliances with other states in order to strengthen its position. For example, at one point, Athens formed an alliance with the Persians. Despite their many differences, both sides agreed that neither of them liked Sparta. Athens needed Persian support to reinforce its navy and keep the Spartans from invading its empire across the sea. Similarly, the Persians were hoping that by supporting they would be able to stop the Spartans from expanding their empire into Asia Minor. Other notable alliances that Athens made included the Argives and the Overall, though Athens' strategy was to try and assemble as many allies as possible to counter the Spartans, Sparta, on the other hand, took a different approach. Instead of trying to assemble a coalition, Sparta kept to itself and relied on its own strength to win the war. This decision proved to be costly for Sparta because it ended up fighting on multiple fronts at once. While Sparta was initially successful on the battlefield, as the war dragged on, it became increasingly difficult to sustain its victories without allies. Eventually, Sparta had to form alliances with the Corinthians and the Thebans in order to defeat the Alright, now let's move on to talking about some of the most important battles of the war. The first battle I want to discuss is the Battle of Marathon. This battle took place early on in the war and was one of the most decisive moments in its entire history. Early in the conflict, the Persians invaded Greece in an attempt to punish the Athenians for their alliance with the Persians. While the Persians vastly outnumbered the